The silence of space was deafening. Beyond the glass walls of the International Space Station, the stars twinkled in the dark void, seemingly indifferent to the lives of those aboard. Inside, the hum of machinery usually provided a sense of comfort, a constant reminder that everything was functioning as it should. But today, the hum had been replaced by a series of alarming beeps, sharp and insistent. The blinking red lights on every console screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. Commander Chris Miller, a seasoned astronaut who had spent more years in space than on Earth, was the first to notice the irregularity. He was staring at the mission control panel, when a sudden vibration rocked the ISS. He steadied himself, reaching out instinctively to grasp the nearest support bar. "Lena," he said, his voice cool but taut with the strain of the moment. "Something's not right." Lieutenant Lena Ortiz, the mission's flight engineer, was at a nearby station, checking systems as usual. Her eyes narrowed when she saw the same alarming red lights. Lena quickly accessed the backup systems, her fingers moving swiftly over the controls. Powers fluctuating, she muttered under her breath. "Not good." Chris moved to her side, his face tightening as he saw the diagnostic results. A micrometeorite had struck one of the external fuel tanks, damaging the delicate life support systems that kept them alive. It was a worst-case scenario, an impact from something that small could easily go unnoticed by most space agencies, but it was the one thing they feared the most. Now, the consequences were unfolding right before them. Lena's hands hovered over the console, her face drawn in concentration. "We've lost about 30% of our oxygen reserves," she reported. "We're not going to make it if we don't fix this fast." Chris took a deep breath, his mind racing through the emergency protocols they had been drilled on for years. But this wasn't a drill. This was real. The usual communication channels to Earth were down, likely as a result of the same impact that disabled their systems. The space station, a marvel of human engineering, was now their prison, silent, empty, and terrifyingly fragile. "I'm going to try to reroute the power," Lena said, her voice steady despite the panic starting to swell inside her. "Maybe we can buy ourselves some time." Chris nodded but didn't speak. He knew the stakes, every second counted. As Lena worked, he reached over to secure the emergency comms panel, praying it would still work. But just as his fingers brushed the console, a loud bang reverberated through the station. The lights flickered, then went out completely. "Damn it!" Lena cursed under her breath, working furiously now, her focus unshaken but her stress palpable. The primary communications array just went down. The room was plunged into a cold, heavy darkness. Chris fumbled for the flashlight strapped to his suit. A few seconds later, the beam of light cut through the blackness, illuminating their faces. The flicker of the light made the situation feel even more precarious, as though the very station they were on might crumble under the weight of the crisis. "Chris, we're running out of time," Lena said, her voice urgent now, the calm demeanor she'd trained for cracking under the pressure. "We can't fix this ourselves. We need help, fast." Chris's heart skipped a beat. Help. Earth. NASA. All of it felt impossibly far away, just a faint memory in the infinite stretch of space. But they weren't alone, NASA was out there, the team at Mission Control would be aware of the situation by now. And that's when it hit him, their only hope wasn't in space. It was back on Earth. It was SpaceX. Elon Musk had changed the game when it came to private space exploration. His company, SpaceX, had already delivered countless payloads to orbit and was building the Starship for future missions to Mars. If anyone could pull off a rescue mission in the nick of time, it would be Musk. Chris pulled himself together, dialing into the backup communication system. The screen blinked back to life. His fingers trembled as he manually sent a distress signal, an emergency transmission to NASA's headquarters. He couldn't wait for protocol. There was no time to waste. "NASA, we've got a critical situation here. Immediate assistance required." We're losing power, oxygen reserves are failing. We need a rescue team, and we need it now, Chris transmitted, his voice strained but resolute. He knew they had to act fast. The signal sent, he wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to remain calm. He had no idea if anyone would receive the distress signal, or if Earth's help could reach them in time. But there was no other option. Lena's voice broke through his thoughts. Chris, listen, if we don't hear back soon, we're going to have to prepare for a manual exit from the station. We might need to attempt an emergency return to Earth without the usual protocols. Chris looked over at her, feeling the weight of her words sink in. They had trained for this possibility, but that was before the disaster, before the panic set in. If they attempted a manual return with their compromised systems, they might not make it. The risk of re-entry failure was high. They could burn up upon re-entry, or worse, drift endlessly in space. Just then, the comms panel flickered to life again. Static. A crackling sound. And then, a voice. "This is NASA," the voice on the other end said, but there was no hint of reassurance in it. "Chris, Lena, we've received your distress signal. Help is on the way, but we need to act fast. We're scrambling to find a solution." Chris exhaled sharply, a small, fleeting sense of relief washing over him. NASA had heard them. But that wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. And then, as if on cue, the voice continued, "Elon Musk is stepping in. SpaceX has confirmed they can make a rescue attempt. They're preparing a mission right now." Chris's heart skipped. Musk. Of course. If anyone could do the impossible, it was Musk. His company had redefined what was possible in space, and now he was their only hope. "How soon can SpaceX launch?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It felt surreal to be asking about Musk's intervention in the midst of such a disaster. But in this moment, Musk's boldness might just be the key to their survival. "We're looking at a 48-hour window," the NASA engineer replied. "It's going to be close, but it's the only chance we have." The tension in Chris's chest grew heavier. Could SpaceX really pull this off? Could Elon Musk and his team reach them in time? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Chris swallowed hard, trying to push away the fear that threatened to consume him. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to entertain a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. Now, it was just a matter of holding on long enough for that hope to turn into reality. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Elon Musk had always been a man driven by a relentless vision. From a young age, he had known that he wasn't like everyone else. While other kids were playing with toys or dreaming of simpler futures, Musk was fascinated by the great unknown, space. He would often stare up at the night sky, imagining a time when humanity would venture far beyond Earth's atmosphere, exploring the stars. His early life in Pretoria, South Africa, was far from glamorous. Musk's parents divorced when he was young, and he often felt like an outsider, an awkward kid with a mind that seemed to operate at a different speed than those around him. Yet, it was precisely this sense of alienation that would later fuel his ambition to change the world. Books became his escape. As a child, Musk devoured the works of Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and other science fiction writers who painted vivid pictures of space exploration and futuristic technologies. It was these stories that planted the seed for his dream, to make humanity a multiplanetary species. He wasn't just interested in space, he wanted to revolutionize technology in every form. After attending Queen's University in Canada and transferring to the University of Pennsylvania, Musk would go on to earn degrees in both physics and economics. His academic background, coupled with his entrepreneurial spirit, set him on a path to disrupt one industry after another. But none of his early ventures, including his work with Zip2 and X.com, which later became PayPal, were enough to satisfy his thirst for a bigger challenge. In 2002, after selling PayPal to eBay for $1.5 billion, Musk founded SpaceX. The idea was simple: reduce the cost of space travel and make it accessible to all. His long-term vision was even more ambitious: colonizing Mars. Musk believed that the survival of humanity depended on expanding beyond Earth, and he wasn't willing to wait for governments or established companies to do it. He would do it himself. But SpaceX's road to success was anything but smooth. When Musk started SpaceX, the idea of sending reusable rockets into space seemed more like science fiction than a real possibility. The space industry was dominated by giants like NASA and Boeing, and the idea that a private company could compete with these established players was laughable to many. Yet, Musk was undeterred. His obsession with innovation and his willingness to take risks became the foundation of SpaceX's success. In 2008, after 3 failed attempts to launch a Falcon 1 rocket, SpaceX was on the brink of bankruptcy. Musk had poured almost every dollar he had into the company, but the future of SpaceX was hanging by a thread. It was only after the 4th launch that the company succeeded, and Musk's gamble finally paid off. The world watched in awe as SpaceX's Falcon 1 became the first privately developed liquid-fueled rocket to reach orbit. This achievement marked the beginning of a new era in space exploration. Despite his growing success, Musk remained focused on the bigger picture: getting humans to Mars. To accomplish this, he needed to make space travel more affordable, efficient, and reliable. Over the next decade, SpaceX would go on to achieve feats that no one thought possible. The Falcon 9 rocket became the workhorse of space travel, and SpaceX's Dragon capsule began ferrying cargo to the International Space Station. Perhaps the most groundbreaking achievement, however, was the development of the reusable rocket, something that could drastically reduce the cost of space travel and open up new possibilities for exploration. Musk's vision was beginning to take shape. But even with these successes, he wasn't satisfied. He wanted to do more. He wanted to put humans on Mars. In 2016, SpaceX announced plans to send a crewed mission to Mars. It was a bold, audacious goal that seemed impossible to many, but Musk was used to thinking big. The world watched as SpaceX unveiled the Starship, a fully reusable spacecraft designed to carry humans to Mars and beyond. Starship's development would become Musk's obsession, pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible in space technology. But there was more to Musk's journey than just rockets and spacecraft. Behind the billionaire entrepreneur was a man with a complex personality, one who had built his empire through sheer determination, a willingness to fail, and an unshakable belief that he could change the world. He was often described as a visionary, but his drive had come at a cost. Musk's personal life was turbulent, with multiple marriages and public feuds, and he had gained a reputation for being demanding, difficult to work with, and intensely focused on his goals. But none of that seemed to matter. Musk was a man on a mission, and nothing would stop him from achieving it. As Musk sat in the boardroom of SpaceX's headquarters in Hawthorne, California, surrounded by his team of engineers and designers, his mind was far away. He wasn't thinking about profits or milestones. Instead, he was thinking about the astronauts stranded on the International Space Station. This was a moment Musk had never imagined, a crisis in space, with human lives on the line. The urgency of the situation was unlike anything he had faced before. He knew that his company's technology, the Starship, was the only viable solution to the problem. But he also knew that this wasn't just about making history, it was about saving lives. His team was already working on the solution. The clock was ticking, and Musk's usual calm demeanor had shifted. This wasn't just about business or the future of humanity, it was personal. In his mind, rescuing the astronauts wasn't just another milestone in SpaceX's journey. It was a chance to prove that humanity, through innovation and determination, could overcome any obstacle. The stakes had never been higher. "We have a 48-hour window," Musk said to his team, his voice steady but intense. "I want Starship prepped and ready for launch. Now." The room went quiet as his engineers began to scramble. There was no time for hesitation. The mission was clear. They would have to move fast if they were going to save the astronauts in time. Musk's mind raced through the calculations, considering every possible complication. He knew that failure wasn't an option. "This is the moment we've been preparing for," Musk said, looking each member of his team in the eye. "We're not just building rockets. We're building the future. Let's show the world what SpaceX can do." As Musk gave his orders and watched his team spring into action, he felt a sense of resolve that he hadn't experienced before. There was no turning back now. The mission was set. The astronauts needed him, and he wouldn't let them down. The situation aboard the International Space Station was deteriorating fast. As the minutes passed, the crew found themselves trapped in a nightmare, suspended in the cold emptiness of space, with the clock ticking down relentlessly. Commander Chris Miller and flight engineer Lena Ortiz had worked together for years, but this was different. They'd faced emergencies before, small technical malfunctions, communication blackouts, even minor accidents, but nothing like this. A catastrophic failure of the station's life support systems was something they had trained for, but the sheer magnitude of the problem was unlike anything they could have anticipated. "Lena, I can't get a handle on this," Chris said, his voice strained as he tried to access the emergency backup systems again. Sweat was starting to bead on his forehead despite the cold temperature of the station, and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. "I've rerouted as much as I can, but we're losing too much oxygen. We don't have the time to fix this." Lena was at her station, her fingers a blur as she manipulated the controls. "If we can stabilize the main coolant system, it might buy us a little more time," she said, her voice calm, almost robotic in its precision. But even she could hear the edge in her own tone. They were fighting against a ticking time bomb, and the cold truth was that the odds of survival were slim without outside help. Chris stared out the small porthole. The stars outside were so close, and yet they felt impossibly distant, like an unreachable dream. For the first time in his career, the vastness of space seemed to close in on him, pressing in from all sides. The stars that once inspired him now felt like cruel reminders of how fragile and fleeting life could be. "There's nothing more we can do here," Chris said after a long pause. "We need to let NASA know we're at critical risk. We don't have the luxury of time." Lena turned to him, her eyes filled with the same unspoken fear he could feel gnawing at his own gut. "And what if they can't help us, Chris? What if this is it?" Chris didn't have an answer. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be fine, that NASA would find a solution. But he couldn't bring himself to say the words. There were no guarantees in space, no certainty. There was only the relentless, unyielding challenge of survival. But just as he was about to say something, the communications console blinked to life, catching both of their attention. The voice that crackled through was familiar, but now it had an urgency that made Chris's stomach churn. "This is NASA Command. Chris, Lena, we've received your distress signal. We're working on a rescue plan. The situation is critical, but we're not giving up on you." Chris's heart skipped a beat. He could hardly believe his ears. A rescue? How? The chances seemed impossible. They were in the far reaches of space, more than 200 miles above Earth's surface. And they weren't the only ones in jeopardy, time was running out for everyone involved. "Who's going to get us out of here, NASA?" Chris asked, his voice taut with disbelief. "What kind of plan are we looking at?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then the answer came. "Elon Musk," the voice said, and the words felt like a shock to Chris's system. "SpaceX is sending a mission to retrieve you. They've already started preparations." The idea of Elon Musk personally orchestrating a rescue felt surreal. SpaceX had become synonymous with cutting-edge technology, but even their Starship program, which Musk had championed for years, wasn't fully operational yet. Could it really be ready for a mission of this magnitude? Chris glanced over at Lena, who looked just as stunned as he felt. SpaceX was known for its breakthroughs in commercial spaceflight, but the scale of this rescue was unlike anything Musk had ever attempted. They were about to place their lives, and the lives of their crew, in the hands of a private company. How soon? Lena asked, her voice steady despite the chaos she felt inside. Do we have time? We've got about 48 hours, the NASA engineer replied. We're pushing the limits here, but SpaceX is going to do everything they can. If anyone can pull this off, it's Musk. Chris closed his eyes, processing the information. SpaceX. The company that had revolutionized space travel, that had sent reusable rockets into orbit, that had begun planning for Mars. But could they really reach them in time? Do we have a backup plan? Lena asked, her voice quieter now, as if she was afraid to hope. Chris shook his head. No backup. This is it. We hold on and trust that Musk's team can get us out of here. He turned back to the communications panel. NASA, tell SpaceX to move fast. We don't have much time. The response from Mission Control was brief but filled with determination. Understood, Commander. We're already in contact with SpaceX. They're all in. As the transmission ended, the silence in the station was almost deafening. Chris and Lena exchanged a look, half disbelief, half cautious hope. We just have to survive until they get here, Chris said, trying to keep his voice steady. Lena nodded. We're not giving up, Commander. We've made it through worse. We'll make it through this. The two of them turned back to the emergency protocols, both now working in silence, each one hoping against hope that Musk's team would truly pull off the impossible. Far below, on Earth, SpaceX's engineers were already hard at work. They knew that the situation aboard the ISS was dire, and they were doing everything they could to prepare Starship for the fastest possible launch. Musk had made it clear, there could be no delays. The astronauts' lives depended on it. As Chris and Lena fought to keep their hope alive, they didn't realize that, in a small office somewhere on the other side of the world, a man named Elon Musk was already preparing to make one of the most daring moves in the history of space exploration. In the heart of SpaceX's headquarters in Hawthorne, California, the atmosphere was electric with a sense of urgency that seemed to electrify the very air. Engineers, mission planners, and astronauts were all working in sync, like a well-oiled machine, preparing for the impossible. Elon Musk stood at the center of it all, his mind racing through every scenario, every calculation. He'd been through a lot in his career, plenty of challenges, risks, and failures, but this was something different. A rescue mission. A mission where every second counted. And more than that, a mission that had the weight of human lives on the line. The plan was simple, or at least it should have been. SpaceX's Starship, the towering spacecraft Musk had envisioned as humanity's future gateway to Mars, was the only one capable of performing the mission. But Starship wasn't just about sending humans to the Moon or Mars. It was designed to carry heavy payloads, to launch with massive power. It was a game changer. But sending it on a rescue mission, especially one as complex as this, was unprecedented. This was a mission Musk knew would test everything his company had achieved. Starship is our only option, Musk said, his voice steady, though there was a sharpness to it. He wasn't one to sugarcoat reality. There was no room for doubt now. Get it ready for launch. We're moving as fast as humanly possible. The crew around him nodded, already moving with a purpose. Each person had a role to play, and no one was wasting a single moment. Technicians were running diagnostics, engineers were double-checking every part of Starship's design, and the flight team was reviewing the mission plan. SpaceX had never attempted a crewed rescue mission this large, but they had no choice. The astronauts aboard the ISS were running out of time, and if SpaceX didn't succeed, no one would. Musk turned to his lead astronaut, John Harris, who had flown with SpaceX on several missions and was the best person for the job. "John, you'll be commanding the mission," Musk said, his tone calm but firm. "We need to make sure Starship can handle the stress of a rapid ascent. Time is everything here." John Harris, a seasoned astronaut with nerves of steel, nodded without hesitation. "We've got this, Elon. Starship's been designed for a mission like this. We're going to get them back." His eyes met Musk's, and in that moment, both men understood the gravity of the mission. This wasn't just another step forward for SpaceX. This was their chance to prove that private companies could do what governments couldn't, that they could change the game forever. Musk turned back to his team, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. They had 48 hours to launch Starship, reach the International Space Station, and bring back the astronauts stranded in orbit. It was a race against time, but Musk had never been one to shy away from a challenge. In fact, he thrived on them. "We've made history before," Musk said, addressing his team. "We've landed rockets, we've launched cargo, and we've sent astronauts into space. This is bigger than all of that. This is about showing the world that we can overcome any obstacle, no matter how impossible it seems." The team erupted in a burst of energy. The mission had taken on a new significance. They weren't just building rockets, they were saving lives. As preparations ramped up, Musk took a moment to himself, standing in front of the large Starship model in SpaceX's mission control. He traced a finger along the smooth surface of the spacecraft, imagining it in the void of space, hurtling toward the ISS. Musk had always believed that technology could change the world, but today, it felt more real than ever. His thoughts were interrupted by the voice of his head engineer, Maria Torres, who entered the room with a stack of documents. "Elon," she said, her expression serious, "we've run all the calculations, and there's no margin for error. The launch has to be perfect." Musk turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "I know. We've built the best rocket in the world. Now, it's about execution." Maria nodded, setting the documents down in front of him. "We've done the pre-launch checks, and Starship is ready. The only challenge is the rendezvous with the ISS. It's a delicate operation, but we've simulated every scenario. We're ready." Musk's mind shifted to the astronauts aboard the ISS, Chris and Lena. He thought about their families, their sacrifices, and the pressure they must be feeling. They were depending on him, on SpaceX, to get them out of this disaster. And Musk wasn't about to let them down. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The countdown had already started. Every minute that passed was one closer to launch. Musk had always been known for his ability to make big decisions under pressure, but today was different. Today, every decision could be the difference between life and death. "We'll do it," Musk said, his voice full of determination. "Starship will launch, and we'll bring those astronauts home." Meanwhile, in the control room, the engineers were making final adjustments. The team was focused, each person aware of the importance of their role. As the countdown began, Musk's mind raced through the final checklist. Starship had never been sent on a mission like this before, but SpaceX had always been willing to push boundaries. With each passing moment, the sense of anticipation grew. The astronauts on the ISS were counting on them, and they weren't about to let them down. Back in space, aboard the International Space Station, Commander Chris Miller and flight engineer Lena Ortiz had long since given up hope of rescue from the usual space agencies. NASA had told them they were working on a plan, but the reality was clear: if help didn't come soon, they would not survive. The situation was dire, and all they could do was hold on and trust that someone, anyone, would answer their distress call. What they didn't know was that the answer was coming from a private company, led by a man who had spent his life defying the odds. They didn't know that Elon Musk was preparing the most ambitious mission in the history of spaceflight, a rescue mission that would prove once and for all that space exploration was no longer just for governments. SpaceX was about to change the future of space travel forever. The morning of the launch was an almost surreal experience. The atmosphere at SpaceX's mission control in Hawthorne was electric, but also charged with an undercurrent of tension. As engineers and flight controllers busied themselves with final checks, Elon Musk stood at the front of the room, staring intently at the large screens that displayed Starship's pre-launch diagnostics. The clock was ticking down. The mission was now only hours away. "We're in the final stretch," Musk said, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge of excitement. He was pacing back and forth as the final steps to prepare Starship for launch were unfolding. "It's going to be a tight window, but we've never been this close before. There's no room for error." Behind him, the engineering team continued to work at a fever pitch, reviewing every metric, recalibrating systems, and testing communication links. Everything had to be flawless, and there were no second chances. The world was watching, and the astronauts in space were waiting on the line between life and death. Maria Torres, head engineer for the mission, stood up from her station and walked over to Musk. "Elon, we've run all of our simulations and have adjusted for every variable. Everything is in the green. We're good to go." Musk nodded but didn't break his stride. "Good. Keep the pressure up, Maria. This needs to be perfect. We've got 2 astronauts in space, and that's all that matters right now." In the control room, the countdown continued with almost eerie precision. The screens blinked red and green, each one monitoring vital signs, fuel levels, oxygen, the alignment of the boosters, the positioning of the launch pads. Every tiny element had to be in perfect harmony. The team was operating on adrenaline now. It was impossible to think about anything but the mission ahead. Meanwhile, aboard the International Space Station, Commander Chris Miller and flight engineer Lena Ortiz were dealing with their own version of a countdown. Every minute that passed brought them closer to their fate, and every breath they took seemed like it could be their last. The emergency lights flickered as the temperature inside the station continued to rise, and the oxygen levels slowly but steadily dwindled. "We're down to less than 24 hours, Chris said, wiping sweat from his brow. "If SpaceX doesn't make it, we won't last much longer." His voice had a rough edge, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The days spent trying to keep the station together were beginning to take a toll on him. Lena, still at the console, had been fighting to keep the life support systems online, but with each passing moment, the chances of success seemed slimmer. She refused to let the desperation in her chest show on her face. "They'll come through," she said, though even she could hear the doubt creeping into her words. Chris walked over to the window and stared out at the vastness of space, the tiny blue planet below. There was something haunting about how peaceful Earth seemed, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding inside the ISS. "They've got to be ready. If they miss this window, we're done," Chris said, trying to hold on to the faintest shred of hope. He turned back toward Lena. "We've made it this far. We just need a little more time." Lena didn't answer right away, her eyes glued to the small monitor in front of her. But she did turn toward him, her expression softening. "I know. We've got this, Chris. SpaceX won't fail us." But even as she said the words, a deep part of her knew that everything they were doing now, every breath, every flicker of hope, depended entirely on whether SpaceX could actually make it in time. There was no backup, no contingency. This was their last chance. Back in mission control, the clock was winding down faster than anyone expected. The countdown was now less than 10 minutes away. Every technician, every engineer, and every flight controller sat at the edge of their seats, their attention fixed entirely on the screens in front of them. "Starship is ready for launch," Maria announced, her voice sharp and precise. "All systems are go. We're moving into the final stage." Elon Musk turned to face his team, the weight of the moment settling in. "This is what we've been working for. For every setback, every failure, every moment of doubt, it's all led to this. We're going to show the world what SpaceX is capable of." And we're going to bring those astronauts home. The room erupted in a burst of focused energy, the team working together in unison to execute the final stages of the launch. Each team member was an expert, a specialist in their field, but today, they were more than that. Today, they were a lifeline. Just as the clock ticked down to the final seconds, the launch pad at the SpaceX facility began to shake. The engines roared to life, filling the air with a deafening sound. The force of the blast sent a cloud of smoke and debris swirling into the sky as the massive Starship rocket began to ascend. It was as if the Earth itself was bending to the will of the spacecraft, which now soared into the heavens, defying gravity in a way that seemed almost mythical. In mission control, the team cheered, their voices rising in triumphant unison as the rocket broke through the atmosphere. Starship was on its way, and for the first time since the emergency began, there was a glimmer of real hope. Launch successful, Maria said, her voice filled with a sense of relief. Starship is en route to the ISS. Musk stood still, his eyes fixed on the screen that showed Starship's trajectory. He knew that this was only the beginning. The hard part still lay ahead. The rendezvous with the ISS would be the true test. Now we wait, Musk said softly to himself. Back aboard the ISS, Chris and Lena stared at the communication console as the words, "Rescue in progress," flashed across the screen. SpaceX had launched. The impossible was becoming possible. Is it really happening? Lena asked, her voice trembling with the weight of everything they had been through. Chris nodded. It's happening. We're not alone anymore. As the rocket continued its ascent, Musk's mission had begun, and it was now a race against time, a race that would determine whether Chris and Lena would return to Earth, or become just another forgotten casualty of space. But for the first time in days, hope was real. And with it, a chance for survival. The vastness of space is both beautiful and terrifying, and as Starship cut through the black void, Elon Musk's gaze was locked onto the live feed from the spacecraft. He could feel the tension mounting in mission control, he could almost hear the collective breath being held by his team. This was the moment that would define the success of their mission. The next few hours would either confirm SpaceX's place in history or deliver a crushing blow. Status update, Musk said, his voice calm, though his mind raced with the many calculations and scenarios unfolding in his mind. Maria Torres, still standing at her console, responded almost immediately. Starship has entered the rendezvous phase. We are aligning with the ISS, and the automated systems are performing as expected. We should be in range in about 15 minutes. The countdown continued, but with each passing second, the complexity of the task ahead became even clearer. This wasn't just a launch, it was a delicate, complex operation that had never been attempted before, an orbital rendezvous with a station that had no margin for error. If the approach was too fast, too slow, or if there was any misalignment, Starship would miss its target. But even a minor misstep during the docking could have devastating consequences. In the control room, the team continued to monitor every aspect of Starship's flight, their eyes glued to the screens showing the spacecraft's path. Engineers adjusted systems and parameters in real time, ensuring the rocket's trajectory remained spot on. The tension was palpable. Elon's mind was sharp. He'd trained for moments like this. He'd spent countless hours envisioning success, but now the stakes felt different. They weren't launching for the Moon or Mars anymore. This was a rescue mission, a rescue that had to work. Inside the International Space Station, Commander Chris Miller and Flight Engineer Lena Ortiz were glued to the communication console. The countdown to the rendezvous had begun. It was still hard for them to believe that someone was actually coming for them, space had always felt so distant, so unforgiving. But now, the thought of being saved was more tangible than ever before. Lena, Chris said, his voice full of quiet awe. This is really happening. SpaceX is on its way. Lena didn't respond immediately. She was too busy checking and double-checking the systems. She was exhausted, but the reality of the situation had sharpened her senses. She felt the weight of every decision she made, every breath she took, as though this were the last moment of their lives. And, for the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope. "Yeah," she said, her voice trembling with relief. "It's happening. We just need to make sure everything holds together long enough." Both of them glanced out the tiny window of the ISS, looking into the infinite darkness, imagining Starship racing toward them. They had no idea how the rescue mission would unfold, but they knew that Musk and his team would do everything they could. They were coming. Back in SpaceX's mission control, the mood had shifted. What once had been frantic energy was now a sharp, quiet focus. All eyes were on the screens showing the telemetry from Starship. The spacecraft was just minutes away from reaching the ISS, and Musk could feel the pressure mount. The clock ticked down to the final moments. "Starship is in final approach," Maria announced, her voice unwavering. "We're at 500 meters and closing. All systems are nominal." Elon stood still, his gaze fixed on the screen, watching as Starship's engines fired in controlled bursts to adjust its trajectory. He knew that this next phase would make or break the mission. He had full confidence in the spacecraft, but the ISS was a different beast. Its massive size, its weightlessness, and its delicate positioning made docking a far more complex task than simply getting to orbit. The docking was going to have to be done manually, using the onboard docking system that was designed for precise control. There was no room for error, no room for an unforeseen hiccup. Every millimeter counted. "John, you're in control now," Musk said, turning to his lead astronaut, who was operating the Starship from within the cockpit. "Make sure we do this right." John Harris, the veteran astronaut who was piloting the mission, nodded. "Roger that, Elon. Locking on to the ISS now." With that, the Starship's massive engines gently fired again, slowing its approach. The spacecraft was now just a few hundred meters away, and the tension inside the spacecraft was palpable. Every engineer at SpaceX was on edge. This was the critical moment, the last chance to ensure the astronauts were brought home safely. Inside the ISS, Chris and Lena watched as Starship loomed ever closer in the distance, its sleek form now visible from their windows. The reality of the situation finally began to settle in. They were moments away from being rescued. But it wasn't over yet. They still had to endure the most delicate part of the entire operation, the docking. "Hold tight," Chris said, turning to Lena. "We're almost there." They stood by as the mission unfolded. The enormous spacecraft, which seemed like something from the future, glided closer to their home in space. They could hear the faint hum of the docking system from inside their station, a reminder of just how technologically advanced this mission was. But for all the advanced systems and preparations, the human element was still key. Chris knew that they were leaving their fate in the hands of the team at SpaceX. And he trusted them. He trusted Elon Musk. With only a few meters remaining, Starship slowed down further, ready to engage the final approach. The controlled burns of the rocket's thrusters gently guided the massive ship toward the docking port of the ISS. A series of beeps echoed from Starship's automated systems, signaling the success of the maneuver. But John Harris knew the hardest part wasn't over yet. "Engaging manual control," John said. His hands moved quickly across the control panels, making minute adjustments, adjusting for the tiniest deviations. "We've got a good alignment. Just need to keep it steady." SpaceX's mission control crew sat in stunned silence, their eyes never leaving the monitors. The connection between the two spacecraft was less than 100 meters away now. Starship's nose was aligning perfectly with the docking port of the ISS, and the crew inside the station felt their hearts race in synchrony with the spacecraft's movements. It was a moment of pure focus, every eye, every hand, every mind on the mission. SpaceX had come so far, but the last few seconds were the most critical. With a soft, yet powerful thud, Starship's docking mechanism made contact with the ISS. The two ships were now connected. Cheers erupted in SpaceX's mission control. The astronauts inside the ISS let out breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. They were finally safe. Elon Musk, who had been watching the whole process with his usual calmness, allowed himself the smallest smile. Mission accomplished, he said quietly, the weight of the entire endeavor lifting off his shoulders. But even as the team celebrated, Musk couldn't help but think about the next steps. The real mission was far from over, but this was a crucial victory. They had brought Chris and Lena back from the brink of disaster, and now, it was time to bring them home. The docking had been a success, but the mission was far from over. Now, the next phase of the operation would prove just as delicate, bringing Commander Chris Miller and Flight Engineer Lena Ortiz safely back to Earth. Inside the International Space Station, the tension from earlier had finally started to ebb away, but it hadn't completely disappeared. Chris and Lena moved through the station as if they were in a daze, unsure of what exactly had just happened. They had been rescued, yes, but the ordeal wasn't over. They still had to make the return trip. Both of them sat in the airlock chamber, their spacesuits snug against their bodies, staring at the Starship docking port with disbelief. Chris looked at Lena and shook his head. "I still can't believe it, we're actually going home." Lena chuckled weakly, her face exhausted. "I was starting to think we might never get out of here." Outside, the blackness of space was as vast as ever. The Earth, a beautiful orb of blues and greens, floated far below them. It was a reminder that their rescue was no small feat, and that the journey home had just begun. Meanwhile, in SpaceX's mission control, Elon Musk was pacing back and forth, his eyes constantly flicking between the various monitors. His team had successfully executed the rendezvous, but the next phase, landing Starship back on Earth, would require an equally flawless performance. Maria Torres, the head of engineering, looked over at Musk with a concerned expression. "We've completed the initial systems check for re-entry. Everything's still on track, but we need to carefully monitor the descent. The heat shields on Starship are critical, and any deviation could jeopardize the entire operation." Musk stopped pacing and nodded, his face hardening with concentration. "I trust the team. Keep me updated on every step. We've come this far. Now it's time to get them home." It wasn't just about the astronauts anymore. Musk was aware that the entire world was watching. This mission was about more than just rescuing two individuals, it was about SpaceX's ability to perform on the highest level, to show that private companies could carry out tasks once thought impossible by government agencies. "Let's make history," Musk murmured to himself. Back on the ISS, Chris and Lena were preparing for the next step. The procedure to board the spacecraft was as meticulous as everything else had been during the mission. Their harnesses were double-checked, their oxygen supplies verified, and each one of their movements was careful and deliberate. The pressure was mounting, but there was no turning back. "Ready for the ride home?" Chris asked, glancing at Lena as they prepared to float into the airlock that would lead them to the awaiting Starship. Lena gave a small smile, her fatigue evident but overshadowed by the excitement of the mission's success. "I've been ready since the moment we got into this mess," she said. "Let's get this done." The moment they stepped through the airlock, they found themselves inside Starship's cabin. It was a strange feeling, space travel was no longer the unfamiliar, mind-boggling experience that it had been when they first launched from Earth. This time, it felt like a return to normalcy. The seats, though comfortable, were designed for the long journey ahead. The sense of security, however, wasn't yet there, not until they were truly back home would they feel the weight of relief. Back in mission control, the mood had shifted once again. The mood was quieter, but the focus was intense. With Starship now carrying Chris and Lena, all eyes were on the spacecraft as it began to perform its complex series of re-entry burns to slow down and descend toward Earth. "Starship is initiating re-entry sequence," Maria Torres said, her voice steady. Heat shields are maintaining optimal temperature. All thrusters are responding. We're good to go. Musk stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. He could feel the nervous energy radiating from his team. No one said it, but everyone knew the truth: the most dangerous part of any space mission was the return to Earth. The risk of failure was high, but SpaceX's team had trained for this. They had prepared for every possibility. It had to succeed. As Starship re-entered the atmosphere, the immense heat began to build around the spacecraft. Inside, Chris and Lena gripped the sides of their seats as the ship vibrated and the roar of atmospheric re-entry filled the cabin. They had been briefed on what to expect, but nothing could prepare them for the raw power of re-entry. Lena glanced at Chris, her eyes wide. "How much longer?" she asked, her voice steady, but a hint of anxiety betrayed her calm exterior. Chris checked his monitor, adjusting his position slightly. "It's going to be a bumpy few minutes, but we're almost there." The turbulence grew more intense. The heat shields of Starship glowed a fiery orange as they entered the thickest part of Earth's atmosphere. The descent was sharp, with the nose of the spacecraft pointing downward, and the G-forces started to press down on them. It was the closest they had come to feeling the true weight of space travel. For several minutes, the violent shaking continued. It felt like an eternity to both astronauts, even though it was only a matter of minutes. Then, suddenly, it started to subside. The spacecraft broke through the turbulent layers of the atmosphere, and the ride smoothed out. "We're through," Chris said, his voice now tinged with relief. "Prepare for final approach." The calm after the storm was a welcome reprieve. But even with the worst behind them, there was still the final step: landing. On the ground, SpaceX's landing team was preparing for the final stage of the mission. The target area had been carefully selected, a remote stretch of coastline where Starship would perform a controlled landing. It was a calculated risk, but it was the only option. "We've got visual on the landing site," one of the team members announced. "Starship is on final approach. Fuel reserves are optimal. Preparing for landing sequence." The Starship had been designed for vertical landing, and the technology had been tested time and time again. But it wasn't over until the craft touched down safely. The final moments were a blur of activity inside the spacecraft. As Chris and Lena prepared for landing, they could feel the rush of anticipation building. Starship's engines fired up again, slowing its descent toward the ground. They were close, so close now. And then, with a soft but firm thud, Starship touched down. "Landing successful," the voice in mission control announced. Cheers erupted throughout SpaceX's headquarters. The crew had done it. Against all odds, the rescue mission had been completed. The roar of cheers that erupted in SpaceX's mission control was deafening. The landing was complete. The Starship had safely touched down, and Commander Chris Miller and Flight Engineer Lena Ortiz were back on Earth. It felt as though the entire world exhaled collectively, their breath held for the duration of the mission, waiting for the final, crucial moment. In the control room, the team's exhaustion melted into pure, unadulterated relief. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, they allowed themselves to acknowledge the success of the mission. There had been moments where things could have gone horribly wrong, but they had persevered. Elon Musk, who had been standing at the front of the room during the final moments of re-entry, stood motionless for a moment. The weight of the achievement was still sinking in. It wasn't just the success of a rescue mission, it was a demonstration of SpaceX's potential. This was history. This was the future of space travel. Musk took a deep breath, allowing himself to savor the moment before turning to his team. "We did it. Great work, everyone." Maria Torres, who had been meticulously monitoring every phase of the mission, gave a nod of approval. "It was a near-perfect operation. But we're not done yet. The real work begins now, the recovery and debriefing phase." Musk smiled faintly. "Right. Let's make sure everything goes smoothly from here on out." Back at the landing site, recovery teams rushed to secure the area around Starship. The massive spacecraft stood like a silent titan in the distance, its towering figure visible against the vast expanse of blue sky. The dust from the landing had settled, but the excitement in the air was palpable. Chris and Lena were helped out of the spacecraft, their fatigued faces softening into expressions of disbelief and gratitude. After all they had endured, the isolation, the tension, the uncertainty, they were finally home. Lena took her first steps back onto solid ground, her legs unsteady from the long journey. She blinked in the bright sunlight, squinting as her senses adjusted. The cool breeze hit her face, and for the first time in days, she felt a deep sense of peace. Chris, on the other hand, stood for a moment, taking in the sight of the world below. He looked up at the sky, his chest rising and falling with a deep breath. "You know, I never thought I'd be this happy to see Earth again." Lena laughed, though it was weak and strained. "Yeah, I think I'll kiss the ground when we get back to base." Their recovery team, a mixture of SpaceX engineers and medical personnel, swarmed around them, guiding them to safety. They were offered water, medical checks, and even a warm welcome from their families, who had been anxiously waiting for news from Mission Control. It was a slow and methodical recovery process. They were both physically drained, but it was the emotional toll that weighed the heaviest. They had both been through something that few would ever experience, and the fact that they had come through it alive, and safely, was a miracle in itself. As Chris and Lena made their way back to the transport vehicles, they couldn't help but steal glances at the Starship, still standing tall on the landing site. It was hard to believe the ordeal had finally come to an end. The enormity of what SpaceX had just achieved was slowly sinking in. "What's next for you?" Lena asked, looking over at Chris. "What do we do now?" Chris shrugged, his face thoughtful. "I'm going to take some time off, I think. Just, take a breath. Maybe visit my family. But after that, I'm not sure." Lena nodded. "Yeah, same here. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually looking forward to going home. Space can wait a little while." The two of them shared a brief, knowing smile. They had both been through an ordeal that most people would never comprehend. But they had survived, and they had done so together. Back at SpaceX headquarters, Musk sat at his desk, staring at the images of the successful mission displayed on his screen. He was quiet, reflecting on the success. Yet even in this moment of triumph, his mind was already racing toward the future. There was no time for complacency, no time to rest on their laurels. "This is just the beginning," he said to himself, his voice barely a whisper in the empty room. He opened up a new set of mission files. Mars was still the ultimate goal, and this mission, this rescue, had shown that SpaceX could go above and beyond expectations. They had done what no one else could have imagined, and that would set the stage for even bolder goals. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the stars visible through his office window. For a brief moment, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. In the days following the rescue mission, news outlets around the world covered the story. The headlines were everywhere, all praising the success of SpaceX's daring rescue. Chris and Lena appeared in interviews, their faces showing the mix of exhaustion and relief that came with such an intense experience. Their families were beside them, their love and support evident in every interaction. But even as the public celebrated the heroism of the two astronauts, there was an undeniable feeling among them that their lives were about to change forever. Both Chris and Lena had become symbols of humanity's resilience, the embodiment of human courage and determination. But they also knew this mission would have lasting consequences for their careers. Chris was offered a hero's welcome, and Lena was lauded for her bravery. Yet they both knew that the mission was far bigger than just them. It was about a future in which private companies could do the impossible. It was about a future where space was no longer something for the government alone, it was something that everyone could strive for, dream of, and reach. As Chris and Lena sat down for a quiet dinner together that evening, they were both lost in thought. They were safe now, back on Earth, but the memories of what they had gone through would stay with them forever. They both knew that space would continue to call to them. "You know, I was thinking," Lena said, breaking the silence. "Once we recover from this, we should go back to space." Chris looked at her, surprised. "Really?" Lena smiled. "Yeah. Maybe not right away, but I think there's more out there waiting for us." Chris nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that. There's always more to explore." The universe was vast, and the future, for both of them, was waiting just beyond the stars. The world had been watching. News outlets, social media platforms, and even casual conversations among families and friends were dominated by the incredible story of the daring rescue. The headlines flashed: "Private Space Company Rescues NASA Astronauts in Historic Mission and SpaceX's Bold Move, a New Era in Space Exploration." But while the world celebrated the success, Chris and Lena were quietly adjusting to their newfound roles. They were no longer just astronauts, they had become symbols of courage and the future of space travel. At SpaceX headquarters, the atmosphere was a whirlwind of activity. Musk had already set his sights on what came next. The mission was a success, yes, but the real challenge lay in maintaining the momentum and leveraging the public's newfound faith in private space exploration. The company had proven its capability, and now it had the world's attention. Maria Torres, still the lead engineer on the mission, found herself reflecting on the next phase of the company's journey. She had been part of something historic, but there was no time to bask in the glory. SpaceX was known for pushing boundaries, and she knew this mission was only the beginning. In a meeting room with Musk and other key members of the team, Maria spoke up. "We've proven the concept, Elon. But we need to start thinking about sustainability. This wasn't a one-off. We need to prove that this level of success is repeatable." Musk nodded, his eyes fixed on the projection of the mission data on the screen. "Right. This was the rescue. Next, we go further. Mars. Colonization. Everything we do from here on out must be with that in mind. This mission was the test. The real work is just starting." Maria raised an eyebrow. "What's the next step, then?" "We build a sustainable plan," Musk said, his voice firm but tinged with excitement. "The world saw what we did. We need to show them that this is just the beginning. Space isn't a far-off dream anymore. It's happening now." Back on Earth, Chris and Lena were adjusting to their new lives in ways they hadn't anticipated. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of interviews, accolades, and media attention. The NASA astronaut community had embraced them, and they had been offered multiple roles within the organization. But both of them knew that their hearts, at least for now, were still in space. Lena, who had once feared she might never see Earth again, was now contemplating what the future held. Space was no longer just a job, it was a calling. As she sat with Chris at a cafe in Houston, the conversation turned to the next mission. It was clear both of them had a shared sense of purpose, though they had yet to put it into words. "What's next for you?" Chris asked, stirring his coffee absently. Lena looked out the window, her gaze distant. "I'm not sure. NASA's got some offers for me. It's tempting, but I feel like I'm supposed to do something else. Something bigger." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Bigger than NASA?" Lena smiled, though it was bittersweet. "Yeah. I think I might go back to SpaceX. I want to be part of something that pushes the boundaries of what we know. Mars, the moon, the next big frontier." Chris nodded slowly, understanding her sentiment. He had the same feeling, the same pull toward the unknown. "Do you think we could really do it? Colonize Mars, I mean?" Chris asked. Lena looked down at her coffee cup. "If anyone can do it, it's SpaceX. They've got the technology, the people, and now, they've got the momentum. This mission showed everyone that space isn't a place for governments alone anymore. At SpaceX, the planning for future missions was already underway. The rescue mission was a landmark achievement, but now it was time for the company to turn its focus toward the ambitious goal Musk had set all along, Mars. Musk had made no secret of his vision. SpaceX wasn't just about sending astronauts to space, it was about building a new home for humanity, one where the future wasn't tethered to Earth. And with the success of the rescue mission, the entire company was emboldened. Elon stood before his team in a press briefing room, the tension in the air palpable. This mission was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that we can rescue astronauts in space, but it's also a reminder of how far we still need to go. We've reached a critical juncture in human history, and the next steps we take will shape our future. He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. Mars isn't a dream anymore. It's a goal. And we're going to get there, sooner than anyone thinks. Lena and Chris, now officially part of the SpaceX team, were sitting at the launch pad, watching as the next Starship was being prepared for a test flight. Their roles in the rescue mission had been significant, but it was clear to both of them that the next step was even more critical. Lena turned to Chris, her eyes focused on the massive spacecraft in front of them. "You know, this feels different now. I don't just want to be a part of this. I want to make a difference." Chris smiled and nodded. "Yeah, I feel the same way. When you're up there, everything changes. You start thinking about the bigger picture. It's not just about missions and accolades. It's about humanity, our future." They both fell silent for a moment, watching the engineers move around Starship with precision and purpose. The future wasn't a distant dream. It was tangible. And it was right in front of them. The next few months were filled with rapid advancements. SpaceX's engineers were working around the clock, refining technology, testing the limits of their spacecraft, and working toward a sustainable future for space exploration. The world was watching, and so was NASA, which had started looking more closely at the potential of partnering with SpaceX for future missions. Meanwhile, Chris and Lena dove into their work, both focused on preparing for their next mission. The challenges were daunting, but there was an electric sense of possibility in the air. They weren't just astronauts anymore, they were pioneers, part of a new generation that would push the limits of space exploration. As the final touches were made on the next mission, Elon Musk stood before the assembled crowd of engineers, scientists, and astronauts, his voice filled with determination. "This is it," he said. "The next step toward Mars. We've proven ourselves capable of the impossible. Now it's time to set our sights even higher. The future of humanity is out there. And we're going to lead the way." The crowd erupted into applause. And for Chris, Lena, and the entire SpaceX team, it was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that would lead them far beyond Earth, to the stars, and perhaps even beyond. The mission to Mars had always been Elon Musk's dream, the beating heart of SpaceX's entire existence. It was a dream that felt closer than ever before. After the success of the rescue mission, the momentum was undeniable. SpaceX had shown the world that it could push the limits of space exploration, and now, it was preparing to take on its most ambitious project yet, a manned mission to Mars. For Chris and Lena, this new goal was both exhilarating and terrifying. They had survived the perilous conditions of space during the rescue mission, but the journey to Mars would be entirely different. This wasn't just about survival, it was about thriving in an environment that was completely alien to them. It was a mission that would take years, not months, and it would test humanity's resilience in ways never before imagined. SpaceX's mission control was filled with the hum of activity. Engineers, scientists, and technicians worked tirelessly around the clock, preparing for what Musk had called the mission of a lifetime. Chris and Lena were no longer just figures of media attention, they were the face of this new era in space exploration. Both of them had become symbols of the resilience needed to go beyond Earth and claim a place on Mars. Lena stood in the middle of the bustling room, her eyes focused on the screen in front of her. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. A few months ago, she had been stranded in space, fighting for her life and her crew's survival. Now, she was staring at a new mission that would take humanity to the Red Planet. "Do you ever stop and think about how far we've come?" Chris asked, standing beside her. Lena looked up from the screen, meeting his gaze. "I try not to. If I did, I think I'd get too overwhelmed. The future is staring us down, but right now, all I can think about is the preparation. Mars won't wait for us to catch up." Chris nodded. "I know what you mean. It's one thing to be on a rescue mission, those are emergency situations. This is planning, strategy, and a whole lot of patience." In a private meeting room at SpaceX headquarters, Musk was deep in conversation with his core leadership team. The goal was clear: get to Mars, and do it safely. The planning for the Mars mission would be meticulous, from developing the necessary life support systems to finding ways to ensure the astronauts could survive the long journey and the harsh conditions of the Martian surface. "Elon, we're going to need more than just spacecraft for this mission," Maria Torres said, standing at the front of the room with a tablet in hand. "We'll need habitats, water production systems, and sustainable food sources for a crew of 4. We can't afford to rely on Earth for resupply missions. The logistics are massive." Musk raised an eyebrow. "How long do you think it'll take us to get everything ready?" Maria exhaled sharply. "A few years, at least. It's not just about building a spaceship. It's about designing a system that can function independently on Mars, where resupply missions won't be feasible." Musk nodded, already lost in thought. He had always been a visionary, but even for him, this was a monumental challenge. Still, he was determined. "We've got the talent. We've got the technology. And we've got the desire to make it happen." As the days turned into weeks and then months, SpaceX's engineers continued to refine their designs for the Mars mission. They worked tirelessly, often pulling long hours to ensure that every aspect of the mission was accounted for. Chris and Lena, now officially part of the Mars team, were involved in the planning process, reviewing simulations, studying Martian landscapes, and making sure they understood what awaited them on the Red Planet. Chris, who had once feared he might not survive his time in space, found himself slowly coming to terms with the idea of spending years away from Earth. But this was different. The mission to Mars wasn't just about surviving, it was about building something bigger than themselves. It was about humanity's next great step. Lena, too, had changed. The isolation she'd once feared had become something she could endure with greater strength. The unknown was no longer as terrifying as it had once been. After all, she had stared into the vastness of space and lived to tell the tale. Now, Mars seemed like a challenge she was ready to face head-on. "I never thought I'd be here," Lena said one evening as she and Chris walked through the SpaceX compound, watching engineers fine-tuning designs for the Mars base. "When I was a kid, I dreamed of being an astronaut. But the reality is something far bigger than I ever imagined." Chris smiled, his gaze fixed on the engineers. "This is bigger than anything anyone could have dreamed of. We're not just going to Mars. We're going to create something new there. We're going to make it a home." Lena nodded thoughtfully. "And that's the crazy part. We're not just exploring. We're building a future." At a press conference, Musk stood before a room full of reporters, his usual confidence on full display. The excitement in the air was palpable, with the entire world eager to hear about the next big step in humanity's journey to Mars. "We're preparing for the most ambitious mission ever attempted in human history," Musk began. "SpaceX's Mars mission will not just be a one-way trip. This is the beginning of something far greater. It's not about getting to Mars, it's about establishing a permanent, sustainable presence there. A new frontier for humanity." The room fell silent as Musk spoke. His words resonated deeply with those in attendance. The mission was no longer just a distant dream, it was becoming a reality. And the world was ready to embrace it. As the mission preparations continued, Chris and Lena grew closer to their goal. The Starship was nearly ready for its first uncrewed flight to Mars, a critical test mission that would pave the way for future human expeditions. In the meantime, Chris and Lena's training intensified. They were learning everything they could about the Martian environment, the gravity, the atmosphere, the radiation, and the geology. Every detail mattered. But beyond the technical preparation, they were preparing themselves mentally for the isolation that would come with being away from Earth for so long. They would be living on Mars for months, perhaps years, with no immediate way to return home. It was the ultimate test of their endurance. One evening, as they sat together reviewing the final checklist for the mission, Chris looked over at Lena. "You ever wonder if we're crazy for doing this?" he asked, his voice light but sincere. Lena smiled, her eyes reflecting the weight of their shared responsibility. "I think if we weren't crazy, we wouldn't be doing it. This is history, Chris. And we're going to be part of it." Chris looked at the mission plans once more, the enormity of it all sinking in. He had spent years dreaming of space, but now, he was about to make that dream come true. And with Lena by his side, he felt ready for whatever the future held. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The weeks leading up to the Mars mission were filled with an electric sense of urgency. The entire world had its eyes fixed on SpaceX, eagerly awaiting the historic launch that would send humanity's first crewed mission to Mars. Chris, Lena, and their team of astronauts had undergone the most intense training imaginable. Every simulation, every test, and every physical challenge had brought them one step closer to the moment when they would board the Starship, bound for the Red Planet. But amid the excitement, there was also a deep sense of isolation. The astronauts were now completely cut off from the rest of the world, living and working in a secure facility that simulated the conditions of a Mars mission. They were preparing not just for the physical challenges of the journey, but also for the mental and emotional toll that would come with being away from Earth for years. Lena sat in a quiet corner of the training facility, her eyes fixed on a small screen showing a simulation of the Mars surface. She could see the barren red plains stretching out in every direction, the wind stirring up dust storms, the stark, unyielding environment that would soon be their home. "Thinking about it again?" Chris asked as he sat down beside her, his voice breaking her reverie. Lena smiled faintly but didn't look away from the screen. "I can't help it. I've spent so much time imagining what it will be like. Now, it's almost here. It feels like we're on the edge of something so massive, and I can't quite wrap my head around it." Chris nodded, understanding her thoughts. "I get it. It's not just about us. It's about everyone who'll follow us, and everyone who'll benefit from what we do. Mars is a symbol. It's a promise. But it's also a responsibility." Lena turned to face him. "And the risk. We both know how risky this is. It's not just a long journey. It's a leap into the unknown." "We're not alone in this," Chris reminded her. "We've got a whole team behind us. NASA, SpaceX, the entire world is backing us." "I know," she replied softly. "But there's always that nagging thought in the back of my mind. What if something goes wrong? What if we're not ready?" "Then we fix it," Chris said firmly. "That's what we've always done. We adapt. We problem solve. That's what makes us different." Lena smiled, grateful for his unwavering confidence. "You're right. We've come this far. We can't back down now." The next morning, the entire crew gathered in the mission briefing room for the final checks before the launch. The mood was a mixture of anticipation and focus. They were about to embark on the most daring space mission in history, and there was no room for mistakes. Elon Musk entered the room, his presence commanding attention. He walked toward the front of the room, looking each of the astronauts in the eye. His usual confident demeanor was tempered by a quiet sense of gravity. This mission meant more to him than just another milestone for SpaceX. It was a culmination of years of dreaming, planning, and pushing the boundaries of what was possible. "Are you all ready for this?" Musk asked, his voice steady. Lena nodded, her eyes locked with his. "We are." "Good," Musk said, his gaze moving to each of the astronauts in turn. "This is not just about reaching Mars. It's about laying the foundation for humanity's future. We're not just taking a leap for science, we're taking a leap for mankind. Everything we do here will affect the future of our species." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We've trained for years. We've prepared for the worst, and we've planned for every possible outcome. But remember, when you get up there, you're not just astronauts. You are pioneers. And pioneers never have all the answers. They learn as they go." Outside, the massive starship stood tall on the launch pad, bathed in the golden light of the morning sun. The engineers had completed the final checks, and the rocket was ready. The world was watching. Cameras from all over the globe had been set up to broadcast the launch live, as millions of people tuned in, hoping to witness history in the making. The countdown had begun. 15 minutes, Maria Torres, the lead engineer, said quietly to the team. She stood next to Chris and Lena, watching the final preparations unfold on a large screen. "Everything is looking good. All systems are green." Lena felt the tension in the air, but she kept her composure. The last few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, but now there was only one thing on her mind: the mission ahead. Chris stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the countdown timer. "We've been waiting for this moment for so long. It feels unreal." "It's not just a trip," Lena said, her voice filled with determination. "It's the future. It's a new chapter for humanity." As the final seconds ticked down, Musk walked over to the astronauts. He gave each of them a nod, a silent gesture of reassurance. He had always been a man of few words when it came to moments like this. He trusted his team, and he trusted the mission. There was no turning back now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition. The starship roared to life as the countdown reached 0. The engines burst into action, sending the spacecraft skyward with an immense force. The astronauts felt the G-forces pushing them into their seats as the rocket accelerated toward space. Lena gripped the armrest in front of her, her eyes wide as the Earth fell away beneath them. For the first time in her life, she felt a deep sense of awe. The reality of space was unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was a vast, infinite expanse that seemed both humbling and exhilarating. As the rocket soared higher and higher, the crew prepared for the long journey ahead. The capsule was equipped with everything they would need to survive the voyage: the life support systems, the food and water supplies, the scientific equipment. Everything was ready. But the true challenge had only just begun. As they left Earth's orbit, the astronauts took a moment to look out the small windows of the capsule. Earth was now just a small, distant blue marble, fading into the endless black of space. They were no longer just citizens of a single planet, they were voyagers, traveling beyond the bounds of their home. "This is it," Chris whispered, his voice filled with awe. "We're really doing this," Lena replied, her eyes filled with determination. "There's no turning back now." The team settled into the rhythm of the mission, knowing that every step they took would bring them closer to their destination. But the vast expanse of space held its own mysteries, and they knew that not everything could be predicted. Still, they were ready. As the days turned into weeks, and the starship continued its journey toward Mars, the astronauts felt the weight of their mission press down on them. It was more than just the technical challenges they faced, it was the responsibility they carried, knowing that they were the ones who would lay the groundwork for humanity's future on Mars. The days on the starship blurred together, each one feeling like a slow, steady march toward an unknown future. Time passed differently in space. Without the usual markers of day and night, the astronauts had to rely on mission schedules and the ever-present hum of the ship's systems to keep track of their journey. The crew had settled into a rhythm. They followed their training, maintained the equipment, ran experiments, and tried to keep their minds and bodies sharp for the challenges that lay ahead. But it wasn't just the technical aspects of the journey that occupied their minds. With each passing day, the enormity of their mission began to settle more deeply into their thoughts. They were not just astronauts, they were explorers, pioneers for the next stage of human history. The weight of that responsibility could be both exhilarating and overwhelming. It was a quiet morning when Chris walked into the common area to find Lena staring out of the observation window, her gaze fixed on the dark void of space. The Earth had long since disappeared from view, replaced by the endless expanse of stars. Mars was still millions of miles away, but the knowledge that they were heading straight for it seemed to pulse in the air around them. "Hey," Chris said, his voice gentle. "What's on your mind?" Lena didn't immediately turn to face him. She was lost in thought, her eyes scanning the vastness of space. "I'm thinking about what's coming," she said softly. "About Mars. We've been preparing for this for so long, and now that we're on our way, it's hard to believe. It's a whole new world. A whole new life." Chris stepped up beside her, his own eyes turning toward the stars. "I get it. It feels surreal, doesn't it? A few months ago, we were in the middle of a rescue mission. Now, here we are, headed to Mars. It's mind-blowing." Lena nodded slowly. "But it's not just about getting there, is it? It's about surviving, thriving. We're going to build something there. People will live there someday. I can't even fathom how that will change everything. It's a new chapter for humanity." Chris chuckled softly, breaking the quiet tension. "You always were the philosophical one, Lena. Me, I'm just focused on the fact that I'm spending a few years of my life on a planet that doesn't have breathable air, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around how that's going to feel." Lena turned and gave him a wry smile. "Yeah, that too." The crew's daily routines were filled with a blend of science and preparation for the realities of life on Mars. They ran simulations of landing scenarios, ensuring that each one of them knew exactly what to do when they approached the Martian surface. They had to be ready for the unexpected. Mars was a planet unlike Earth, with challenges no one could truly anticipate. There was a palpable tension in the air, but there was also a deep sense of camaraderie. One of the most significant milestones of the mission came when the ship's artificial gravity system was finally shut off, simulating the low gravity of Mars. The astronauts floated freely through the ship, their bodies adapting to the unfamiliar sensation. It was a strange but exhilarating experience, a reminder that they were not just crossing space, they were preparing to step onto a completely different world. Days turned into weeks, and the crew grew accustomed to their routines. They exercised to maintain their muscle mass, ran experiments to test how their bodies were adjusting to the space environment, and studied data from Earth, fine-tuning their plans for the Mars mission. But there were moments when the isolation of deep space began to weigh on them. The distance between the starship and Earth was growing, and there was no way to escape the knowledge that they were, in many ways, alone. Communication with Earth was limited by the vast distance, and there was only so much interaction they could have with their families, friends, and the world that seemed so far away. Lena found herself thinking more and more about what Mars would be like, the challenges, the triumphs, the isolation. But she also thought about the people who would follow them. She had always believed in the power of exploration and discovery, and now, more than ever, she understood the weight of the responsibility that came with it. "We're really doing this," she said one evening as she and Chris sat together in the common area. "We're going to be the first people to step foot on Mars. There's no going back from that." Chris looked at her, his eyes steady. "No, there's no going back. But that's what makes it worth it. This is history. And we're going to make it." Weeks later, the crew stood together in the observation bay, staring out at the sight that had consumed their thoughts for so long. The distant glow of Mars was now visible in the vastness of space. It was closer than they'd ever imagined, its red surface reflecting the light of the sun as the starship continued its approach. "It's beautiful," Lena whispered, her voice filled with awe. "I thought I knew what it would look like, but seeing it, it's more than I could have imagined." Chris stood beside her, equally captivated. "It's just the beginning, Lena. The real work starts when we land." The excitement in the room was palpable, but there was also a quiet sense of reverence. Mars wasn't just a place, they were about to make it a home. And they knew that the challenges ahead would be unlike anything they had ever faced. The next few days were a blur of preparations as they prepared for the final descent. They reviewed landing protocols, checked the equipment one last time, and ran through the final steps of the mission. Everything had to go perfectly, there would be no second chances. As the starship entered Mars' atmosphere, the crew felt a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. The ship's heat shields glowed bright red as they descended through the thin Martian atmosphere. The turbulence was intense, but they held steady, trusting in the technology and their own training. "We're getting close," Chris said, his voice tight with excitement. "This is it." Lena nodded, her heart racing. "It's not just the landing. It's the beginning of everything." The starship's engines roared as it began to slow down, guiding the ship to its final destination. Mars was no longer a distant dream, it was within reach, and the astronauts were about to make history. With a gentle thud, the starship's wheels touched down on the Martian surface. The crew sat in silence, staring out the windows at the red landscape. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Then, Lena turned to the others. "We did it. We're here." And just like that, humanity had arrived on Mars. The starship rested on the Martian surface, its landing gear solidly in place. The red landscape stretched out in all directions, a barren expanse of rocky terrain and distant hills. The crew was silent as they took in the reality of their arrival. The excitement of the past months, of the endless simulations, training sessions, and theoretical calculations, had finally culminated in this moment. The world had waited for this, and now the first human footsteps on Mars had been made. But those steps weren't yet taken. Before they could set foot on the planet, there was work to be done. Inside the ship, the crew was busy with final checks. The pressure suits were sealed, the airlocks were double-checked, and the mission control teams back on Earth monitored every move, every reading. Every system in the starship had to be perfect. "Ready, Chris?" Lena asked as she adjusted her helmet, checking the seals one final time. She stood at the airlock, her hand resting on the control panel, ready to open the door that would bring them from the confines of the spacecraft to the harsh expanse of Mars. Chris nodded, his face covered by his own helmet. "Ready as we'll ever be." Lena took a deep breath, her heart racing. They had trained for this moment for so long, and yet it still felt surreal. She glanced around at the other astronauts, who were all preparing for their own first steps. There was a quiet intensity in the room, everyone was aware that this was not just a moment for them, but for all of humanity. This was the beginning of something extraordinary. Maria, the mission commander, stood beside them, her hands steady as she went over the final procedures. "We're stepping into history today. But remember, this is just the first step. We have a long journey ahead of us, not just on Mars, but as humanity learns to live and thrive here." The crew nodded, taking in her words. They had known this moment would come. But standing at the threshold of the airlock, facing Mars itself, was another experience entirely. "All right, Lena," Chris said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion, "I think it's time." Lena activated the airlock controls, and the massive door slid open. The vacuum of space had already been replaced with the thin atmosphere of Mars, which seemed almost ghostly in its stillness. The winds were calm, the sky was a muted orange, and the planet was eerily quiet. The vastness of Mars, with its endless horizon, greeted them with both an invitation and a challenge. Lena took a step forward, followed by Chris. The gravity on Mars was only about 38% of Earth's, and their boots sank slightly into the red dust as they touched the Martian ground. The feeling was like nothing they had ever experienced, light, almost like they were floating, but still grounded enough to know they were standing on a foreign world. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The Earth's blue orb was no longer visible, all they could see was the vast, red desert surrounding them. It was a place that had never known human feet before, a place that had been nothing more than a distant dream for generations. "This is it," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible through the comms. "We've made it." Chris turned to her, a proud smile breaking across his face, though it was hidden behind the helmet. "We did it. Together." The first few hours on the surface were filled with excitement and a sense of disbelief. The crew carefully mapped out the surrounding area, making sure to document their every movement. Every rock, every crevice, every feature of the landscape was catalogued and examined. This was history being made in real time, and the eyes of the world were on them. But the weight of the mission soon became apparent. The beauty of Mars, the stark, barren beauty, was tempered by the realization that this was a hostile environment. The dust storms that could arise without warning, the freezing temperatures at night, and the thin atmosphere all posed serious risks. This was no easy feat. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving in a world that didn't care if humanity made it or not. "We need to begin setting up the habitat," Maria reminded the team as they gathered in the central control room aboard the starship. "Our initial landing site is only temporary. We've got to get the base up and running so we can establish a permanent presence here." The astronauts moved swiftly, their training kicking in as they began unloading supplies and setting up their first Martian base camp. The habitat modules were designed to be self-sustaining, providing the crew with the life support they needed. Every piece of equipment was critical, from the water recycling systems to the solar panels that would provide power to the base. They had practiced these tasks countless times, but now, it felt different. Now, their lives depended on every step. As they worked, Lena felt a sense of awe that she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the thrill of being the first to walk on Mars. It was the realization of what they were creating. They weren't just laying the groundwork for future missions, they were creating a new home for humanity. The significance of that was not lost on her. Hours turned into days, and the work on Mars continued without pause. The astronauts built the first section of their habitat, set up life support systems, and began their scientific experiments. They tested the Martian soil for potential resources, studied the atmosphere, and began setting up communication systems with Earth. Despite the excitement, the isolation of being so far from home began to weigh heavily on the crew. They had been trained for this, of course. They knew that deep space travel, especially to Mars, would involve periods of isolation and mental challenges. But no amount of preparation could truly prepare them for the emotional toll it took to be so far away from loved ones and the world they knew. As Lena sat alone in the observation bay one evening, looking out at the Martian landscape, she couldn't help but feel the weight of that isolation. She longed for the familiarity of Earth, the sounds of the city, the voices of her friends and family, the warmth of the sun. On Mars, everything was unfamiliar, everything was alien, and yet it was also their new home. The only sound in the observation bay was the hum of the life support systems and the occasional crackle of static on the radio. Lena knew she wasn't alone. Chris, Maria, and the rest of the crew were all feeling the same thing. But they had a job to do, and they would see it through, together. That night, as they gathered for their evening check-in, Lena spoke up. "We're making history," she said, her voice steady. "But I think we're also building something more than just a base. We're building a future. A future for humanity." Maria smiled, her eyes reflecting the same sense of pride. "Exactly. This isn't just about us. It's about everyone who'll come after us. We're not just astronauts, we're the first settlers on a new world. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, casting a dim, reddish light over the Martian surface, the astronauts took their first steps beyond the starship. With each step they took, the mission became more real. They weren't just visitors, they were Martian pioneers, laying the foundations for generations to come. Their journey had only just begun. The first few days on Mars were a whirlwind of activity. The crew worked tirelessly to establish a foothold on the barren planet. They had to secure a safe, livable environment, collect data, and begin the essential task of ensuring long-term survival. But, as the days passed, reality began to set in. The challenge of living on Mars wasn't just about setting up a base, it was about surviving in a world that was both beautiful and unforgiving. Lena stood in the habitat's control room, staring at the readings on the monitor. They had successfully established the first section of the base, and the life support systems were functioning as expected. Yet, even as the numbers on the screen showed that they were holding steady, there was a lingering sense of unease. Chris, who had been working with the solar arrays outside, stepped into the room, his face weary but determined. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice tight with frustration. Lena turned to him, her brow furrowing. "What's going on?" "There's a dust storm brewing on the horizon," Chris replied, pointing at the monitor showing a vast expanse of red clouds swirling in the distance. "It's coming faster than we anticipated. We may need to make some adjustments to our plans." Lena's heart sank. Dust storms on Mars were not uncommon, but their intensity could vary greatly. The storms could last for days, even weeks, and the fine particles could wreak havoc on the equipment, clogging filters, damaging solar panels, and reducing visibility to near zero. It was one of the most unpredictable and dangerous aspects of life on the planet. "We knew this was a possibility," Lena said, trying to steady her nerves. "But it's happening sooner than we expected." "What's the status of the habitat?" Chris checked the readings. "The habitat is holding up for now, but we need to reinforce the exterior. We've already had a few warnings from Mission Control. The storm could hit within the next 24 hours. Maria, who had been reviewing data in the corner, looked up. "We'll need to batten down the hatches. Secure everything outside. It's going to be a long haul." The crew immediately got to work. They spent the next few hours ensuring that everything outside the habitat was secured. The solar panels were tilted to minimize the impact of the storm, and all external equipment was sealed. Inside, they worked together to double-check the life support systems, making sure the air filtration system was fully operational and that there was enough power to last through the storm. As the sun began to set, the dust storm began to creep closer. The winds picked up, causing the dust to whip through the air, swirling in chaotic patterns. The crew retreated into the safety of the habitat, closing the airlock behind them. The last rays of sunlight faded, and the Martian landscape was swallowed by the storm. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The crew gathered in the main area, where they monitored the storm's progress on the control screens. The faint rumble of wind echoed through the habitat's walls, a constant reminder of the harsh reality outside. "We'll be okay," Chris said, trying to reassure the group. But his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Everyone could feel the weight of the situation. They were isolated on a foreign planet, and for the first time since landing, they realized just how vulnerable they were. The next few hours were filled with the eerie silence of the dust storm. The only sounds were the hum of the life support systems and the occasional crackle of static over the comms. Outside, Mars was shrouded in a thick, reddish haze. Visibility was zero, and the landscape was completely obscured. Lena sat by the observation window, watching the swirling dust as it danced in the storm. The reality of their situation hit her harder than ever. This wasn't just a scientific mission or an exploratory journey, it was a fight for survival. "We've trained for this," Maria said, her voice calm despite the tension. "We knew there would be challenges. But we also know how to handle them." We've got the skills, and we've got each other. Lena nodded. I know. But it's hard not to feel small. It's easy to forget that we're not in control out here. Mars doesn't care about our plans. We're at its mercy. Maria stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. That's exactly why we're here. To prove that we can survive. To show that humanity can adapt and thrive. The challenges will come, but we will meet them. Hours turned into a full day as the storm raged outside. The habitat was secure, and the crew settled into a forced sense of routine. They played cards, ran simulations, and continued to monitor the storm's progress. The days were long, filled with the monotony of waiting, but they knew the storm would pass. They just had to hold on until it did. On the second day of the storm, the situation grew more dire. The dust had begun to clog the filters of their life support systems, and the solar panels had been nearly completely obscured by the fine red dust. They had power, but it was limited, and there was no way of knowing when the storm would end. We need to conserve power, Maria said, her tone serious. We can't risk depleting our reserves. We'll have to cut back on everything that's not essential. The crew immediately began rationing their power usage. Lights were dimmed, the temperature was lowered, and non-essential systems were turned off. They all knew that they had to make every resource last. Mars wasn't forgiving, and they had to be resourceful if they wanted to survive the storm's full duration. By the third day, the storm began to show signs of waning. The winds had subsided slightly, and the dust was beginning to settle. But even though the worst of the storm was over, the crew still faced the aftermath. They needed to assess the damage, clean the filters, and recalibrate their systems. It would take days to get everything back to full operational status, but they were determined to push forward. As they ventured out to survey the damage, they found that the dust had left a thick coating on every surface. The solar panels had been all but useless during the storm, and it would take several hours of cleaning before they could begin to recharge the habitat's power reserves. This is going to take time, Lena said, looking at the damage to the equipment. But we can fix it. We have the tools, and we have the knowledge. We've faced storms before, and we'll face this one. It's just part of the mission. Chris nodded in agreement. We're stronger because of it. The next few days were a blur of hard work and perseverance. The crew had to rely on their training and each other as they worked tirelessly to restore the habitat's functionality. The storm had tested them, but it had also brought them closer together. They shared moments of quiet reflection as they worked, knowing that every task they completed was another step toward their goal. Mars had given them their first major challenge, and they had overcome it. They were still alive, still strong, and still committed to the mission. They were Martian pioneers, and the dust storm was just one of many obstacles they would face on this alien world. As Lena sat in the observation bay once more, watching the Martian horizon slowly clear, she realized something. This journey wasn't just about surviving on Mars. It was about learning to live with it, adapting to its challenges and turning them into triumphs. And in that moment, she felt more confident than ever that they were ready for whatever came next. The Martian dust storm was finally over, leaving behind a planet that seemed as vast and mysterious as ever. The red landscape, though still harsh and unforgiving, now held the promise of a new beginning. Lena stood at the observation window once more, gazing out at the horizon, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. They had survived the storm, and now it was time to move forward. The crew was busy restoring the final systems of the habitat, cleaning the solar panels, and recalibrating the power grids. Despite the physical exhaustion, there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. They had been tested, but now they could begin to focus on the true mission, the exploration and colonization of Mars. Maria entered the room, her expression determined. We've got the systems back online. Power reserves are fully restored, and the life support system is stable. We can begin our next phase. Lena turned to face her, a tired but hopeful smile on her face. What's next, Commander? We begin the first exploration mission, Maria replied, her voice steady. We've completed our preliminary setup, but now we need to gather more data about the surrounding terrain. We'll scout for potential locations for long-term habitation and resource extraction. Lena felt a thrill at the thought. They had come so far, and now they were moving beyond the safety of their base, venturing out into the unknown. The risks were immense, but the reward was even greater. It was time to take the next step in humanity's journey on Mars. The next day, the crew suited up for their first official exploration mission. The starship had landed in a relatively flat region of Mars, a few kilometers from the base, but the terrain was still challenging. The landscape was riddled with rocky outcrops, craters, and ravines. The weather, though calm for now, was always unpredictable. They knew that any mission could be their last if they weren't careful. Lena, Chris, and Maria were the first to embark on the expedition. They loaded their rover with essential supplies, water, food, communication equipment, and geological tools. Their goal was to explore the nearby area for possible locations that could support a permanent human settlement, as well as to gather samples of Martian soil and rocks. The rover's wheels crunched against the dust as they drove away from the base, leaving behind a small cloud of red particles in their wake. As the base grew smaller in the distance, Lena felt a strange sense of detachment. They had spent so much time preparing for this moment, and yet it felt unreal. They were on Mars, on an alien planet, and everything was unfamiliar. The entire mission was a bold experiment in human survival, and they were at the forefront. "Look at this," Chris said, pointing to a rock formation in the distance. "We're really here." Lena nodded. "Yeah. We're not just here to explore, though. We're here to stay. And that means we have to learn to live here, not just survive." Maria spoke up from the front seat. "Exactly. Our first priority is to find a place with access to resources, water, minerals, anything that could make future missions more sustainable." They drove for several hours, stopping every so often to collect samples and take readings of the Martian soil. The rover's equipment scanned for signs of water beneath the surface and took measurements of radiation levels, temperature, and atmospheric conditions. They had learned in simulations that every detail mattered, no resource could be overlooked. They had to gather as much data as possible to ensure the long-term survival of future colonists. As they continued their journey, the landscape began to shift. The terrain grew more rugged, with large craters scattered across the horizon. A few kilometers ahead, they saw a wide valley with jagged cliffs on either side. "Is this the kind of area we should be looking for?" Lena asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Maria slowed the rover and pulled up a map on the screen. "This area is definitely interesting. The valley could be a great spot for building a habitat, especially if there are caves or overhangs to provide shelter from the dust storms. We'll need to take samples, but I think it's worth investigating further." They continued toward the valley, excited by the possibilities that lay ahead. The closer they got, the more Lena felt the weight of their mission. They weren't just explorers, they were pioneers, forging a future for humanity on a world that had never known human life. By the time they reached the valley, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Martian surface. They parked the rover and set up camp, knowing that they would have to spend the night on the planet's surface before making their way back to the base. As the crew gathered around a small campfire, one of the few luxuries they had brought with them, they began to reflect on the day's journey. The sense of isolation was undeniable. The quiet, barren landscape stretched out endlessly in all directions. There was no sound, no movement, except for the occasional gust of wind stirring the dust. "I can't believe we're sitting here on Mars, having dinner around a campfire," Chris said with a grin, taking a bite of his freeze-dried meal. "This is surreal." Lena smiled, but there was a note of seriousness in her voice. "I keep thinking about the future. About how people will look back on this moment and realize that we didn't just land on Mars, we built something here. We've started a whole new chapter in human history. Maria leaned back against a rock, staring out at the valley. That's the goal. And it's going to take time, effort, and resources. But we have to keep pushing forward. One step at a time. The night passed quietly. The crew worked in shifts, monitoring the rover's systems and gathering additional samples. The cold Martian night settled over them, and Lena couldn't help but feel a profound connection to the planet beneath her feet. She wasn't just a visitor here, she was a part of it. A part of something bigger. The next morning, the crew packed up their gear and prepared to head back to the base. They had gathered valuable data, but there was still so much to explore. The valley they had discovered was promising, but they needed to be sure before they made any permanent decisions. As they climbed back into the rover and drove back toward the base, Lena felt a new sense of resolve. Mars had tested them, yes. But it had also opened up new possibilities. The challenges were many, but so were the opportunities. They had come to Mars to learn, to explore, and to build a future. And though the journey was far from easy, Lena knew that this was just the beginning. As the base came into view, she could see the distant shape of the starship, standing tall against the Martian horizon. It was a symbol of their triumph, of everything they had already accomplished. But Lena knew there was so much more to come. They had just scratched the surface. Mars was a planet of extremes, both breathtakingly beautiful and fiercely unforgiving. The crew had already begun to get a sense of its mood swings, from the dust storm that had nearly shut them down to the calm, surreal tranquility that followed. But as they settled back into the base, Lena felt something else stirring within her, an unshakable sense of curiosity. Mars was vast, and they had only just begun to scratch the surface. The data they had collected from the exploration mission was invaluable, but it had only answered a fraction of the questions they had. They had found promising locations for a potential settlement, but there was so much more to learn. The geological makeup of Mars, its water reserves, and its underground caves remained mysteries. The next phase of the mission would involve digging deeper, literally. Lena sat at the base's command center, studying the maps of the Martian surface. Chris, Maria, and the rest of the crew were going over the latest findings. They had detected unusual readings in one of the valleys they had surveyed. The reading suggested that there could be something buried beneath the surface, something important. Lena tapped her fingers on the desk, lost in thought. If there's anything down there, we need to know what it is. Could be vital to our mission, and maybe even to humanity's future here. Maria glanced at her, then at the rest of the team. We've been talking about drilling into the surface for weeks now. The soil composition and the readings from that valley make it look promising. But digging through Mars' crust is no easy task. We've got the equipment, but the risks are high. Lena's mind was racing. The unknown had always been a source of fascination for her. When she had first joined NASA, the idea of exploring uncharted territory had been a driving force. But now, with the potential to uncover something buried deep within Mars, it felt different. It wasn't just about exploration, it was about survival. We've come this far, Maria, Lena said, standing up from her chair. I think it's time we push a little further. Whatever's down there could be the key to securing our future here. Maria hesitated for only a moment, but then nodded. Agreed. We'll start preparations. But we need to be cautious. We don't know what kind of pressure or instability the planet's crust might have. This could be more dangerous than anything we've faced so far. The next few days were filled with meticulous planning and preparation. The drilling equipment had to be tested and recalibrated, and the team spent long hours simulating the process. They ran through every possible scenario: what would happen if they hit an unstable layer, if the drill malfunctioned, or if something unexpected was buried beneath the surface. No stone was left unturned, and every member of the crew had a role to play. Lena and Chris spent hours in the lab, analyzing the geological data from the valley. The readings were unlike anything they had encountered before: odd magnetic fields, unusual mineral compositions, and signs of possible subterranean water. Whatever lay beneath the surface, it was something Mars had been hiding for billions of years. "We're about to make history," Chris, Lena said one evening as they sat together, looking over the data. Chris grinned. "And if it all goes wrong, we'll be the first ones to know." Lena chuckled, but her mind remained focused. This was their chance to truly understand Mars, not just its surface, but what lay hidden beneath. The stakes couldn't have been higher. On the morning of the mission, the team gathered in the base's operations room. The mood was a mix of excitement and apprehension. They all knew the risks, but they also understood that this was the next logical step in their exploration. "Drill team, you're up," Maria announced, looking at Lena, Chris, and a few other crew members who would accompany them. "Let's move out." The drill, which was a state-of-the-art machine designed for deep Earth exploration, was ready. It was capable of drilling into Mars' crust and collecting samples without causing significant disturbance. But even with the best technology, there was no certainty. Mars was full of surprises. The rover was loaded with all the necessary equipment for the drilling operation. Lena could feel the weight of the moment as they made their way toward the valley. The rover bounced over the rocky terrain, and the Martian landscape stretched out endlessly in every direction. The silence was eerie, but it was the silence of discovery, of venturing into the unknown. As they arrived at the designated site, they began to set up the drill. The landscape here was different from the flat plains they had seen before. Craggy hills and deep ravines surrounded them. It felt like they were on the edge of something ancient, something forgotten by time. Lena and Chris worked quickly with the drill team, ensuring that everything was in place. The drill was positioned carefully, angled to hit the most promising geological layer. The crew members moved with precision, each of them fully aware of the importance of what they were about to attempt. Once everything was ready, Maria gave the signal. "Let's start drilling." The sound of the drill starting was like a deep, rumbling growl, as if Mars itself was awakening. The machine began to work its way into the crust, slowly but surely. For the first few meters, everything seemed normal. The drill passed through layers of rock and dust with ease. But as they reached deeper, the readings on the monitor began to fluctuate. Lena leaned forward, staring at the display. "What's happening?" "The readings are spiking." Chris's fingers flew over the controls, trying to analyze the cause of the fluctuation. "It's hard to tell. The density's changing. Something's not right." Just as Lena was about to speak, a loud crack echoed from beneath the surface. The drill's movement slowed, and then there was a jolt, a sharp, violent shift that rattled the entire rover. "Shut it down! Shut it down!" Lena shouted, but it was too late. The drill had hit something unexpectedly hard, and the force of the impact had triggered a chain reaction. The machine jerked, and the control systems malfunctioned, causing the entire drilling platform to shake violently. The crew scrambled to regain control, but the damage was already done. The monitor flickered, showing a series of chaotic readings. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. The drill had stopped, its massive head wedged deep into the Martian crust. Lena's heart pounded as she stared at the screen, waiting for any sign of what they had just unleashed. The crew worked quickly to assess the damage to the drill, but as they did, an unsettling feeling began to settle over them. They had just tapped into something. And whatever it wasn't what they had expected. "We need to pull it out," Chris said, his voice tense. Lena nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they had just uncovered something much more significant than a simple geological layer. What was buried beneath the surface of Mars? What had they just disturbed? The atmosphere in the base was tense as Lena and the crew made their way back after the drilling incident. Mars, it seemed, had not just been a silent witness to their presence, it had been hiding something. Something that had reacted violently to their intrusion. As they entered the base, Lena felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The drill had come to an abrupt halt, wedged deep into the Martian crust after hitting an unexpected hard surface. The readouts on the monitors had been erratic, sending flashes of data that none of them could fully process. But one thing was clear, the drill had triggered something. They had disturbed something ancient, and Mars was not pleased. "Are we sure the drill's in one piece?" Maria asked as she entered the command center, her voice betraying her calm demeanor. She was the leader of this mission, and it was up to her to keep the team focused, but Lena could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "We're not sure," Lena said, glancing at Chris, who was working on the diagnostics terminal. The system scrambled. "We've got a lot of data to sift through, but it's not good." Chris swiveled around in his chair, his face pale. "Lena's right. The drill's damaged. I can't get the full picture, but there's definitely something there. Whatever it was that stopped us. I don't think it's natural." Lena's mind raced. Whatever they had encountered down there, it wasn't just a random geological anomaly. Something had resisted their drill's efforts, something strong, deliberate. But the question lingered, what was it? "We need to go back," Lena said suddenly. The words came out before she had fully thought them through, but they felt right. "Whatever that was, it's buried deep. It's not just rock. We have to figure out what it is before it's too late." Maria looked at her, the faintest trace of doubt in her eyes. "You know the risks, Lena. We barely survived the storm and the drilling accident. We can't afford to rush into this without more information. We have to understand what's down there," Lena pressed. "It could be the key to everything we've been working toward. Water. Resources." Or, she trailed off, unsure of how to finish the thought. Maria exhaled sharply. "All right. We'll go back, but we're doing it carefully. We need a full team. And we need more data before we attempt another drill. No surprises this time." The next few days were spent in intense preparation. The crew worked around the clock, poring over the data from the drill. They ran simulations, double-checked their equipment, and plotted a new course of action. But despite their careful planning, a sense of unease hung in the air. No one could shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something far bigger than they had anticipated. Lena sat alone in her quarters late one night, staring at the Martian landscape outside her window. It was silent, as always. The cold expanse stretched on forever, broken only by the silhouette of their habitat and the faint outline of the starship in the distance. It was both comforting and haunting, knowing they were so far from Earth, so isolated, yet so connected to this alien world. "What are you hiding, Mars?" she thought, feeling the weight of the planet's mysteries pressing down on her chest. She stood up and walked over to her desk, running her fingers over the geological data they had collected. There had to be something, some clue, that would help them make sense of the readings. Lena's eyes scanned the data once again, her gaze stopping on a series of numbers that had puzzled her since the first analysis. There it was again. A strange magnetic fluctuation. It was so faint, so subtle, that it had almost been missed the first time. But now, with everything they had learned, it seemed to stand out like a beacon. "Magnetic anomaly," Lena muttered to herself. But why? And why is it only in this specific area? Her mind raced. Magnetic anomalies were often associated with underground structures or metals, but what kind of metal could cause a fluctuation like this? And why would it be buried so deep in Mars' crust? Lena didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing: they were about to uncover something extraordinary. The next day, Lena and the team assembled in the operations room to discuss their next move. Maria stood at the front, addressing the group with the same calm confidence that had seen them through so many challenges. "All right, everyone, we're moving forward with the next phase," Maria began. "We've gone over the data, and it's clear that something's down there. The magnetic anomaly is too specific to be a coincidence. We're going to attempt another drill, this time with enhanced equipment designed to penetrate deeper without causing instability. Lena could see the crew's nerves, but there was a shared determination in the air. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Whatever lay beneath the surface, they would uncover it. We'll be going in with extra precautions, Maria continued. A smaller crew. And we'll be working in shifts so that everyone is well rested. This is a high-risk operation, and we need to be prepared for anything. Chris stood up from his seat, his expression thoughtful. What if we're dealing with something that's not just a resource? What if it's not just a metal or a mineral? We need to consider the possibility that this could be something artificial. Something, built. The room went silent. The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. An artificial structure. On Mars. Could it be? Lena could see the looks exchanged between the team members, each of them processing the idea in their own way. The notion seemed outlandish, even for a group of people who had willingly signed up for the most audacious space mission in history. But the magnetic anomalies didn't lie. We can't rule anything out, Lena said, breaking the silence. We've come to Mars to discover the unknown. Now, we have to be prepared for the possibility that this is something far more significant than we ever imagined. As the team made their way back to the drilling site, the sense of anticipation grew. The rover's engines hummed in the quiet Martian morning as they drove over the barren landscape. The location was just ahead, where the drill had last hit something unexpected. Lena's thoughts were swirling. What would they find when they drilled again? What would Mars reveal to them this time? A buried relic from an ancient civilization? A natural formation that defied explanation? Or something entirely different? As they arrived at the site, the drill was already positioned. They would begin where they left off, but this time, there would be no rushing. No surprises. Lena stood at the base of the rover, watching as Chris calibrated the drill for a deeper, slower penetration. The red dust swirled around them in the weak Martian wind, but it didn't matter. They were about to uncover the secret beneath Mars' surface. And whatever it was, it would change everything. The vibrations of the drill were felt throughout the rover as it began its descent into Mars' crust once again. Lena watched closely, her eyes fixed on the monitor as the drill's massive head ground through the layers of Martian soil. The deeper they went, the more cautious everyone became. The mysterious readings that had been recorded earlier hung over them like a dark cloud. What would they encounter this time? And how would they react? The drill bit through the rock with a low hum, gradually breaking through the hard, unyielding layers. It had taken hours to reach this point, carefully advancing at a rate slower than the previous attempt. This time, there would be no abrupt shocks or unexpected malfunctions. They were determined to proceed with precision. Lena's fingers drummed nervously on the console. She glanced at Chris, who was monitoring the readouts and adjusting the drill settings. His brow furrowed as he studied the data carefully. The readings are shifting, Chris said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The resistance is increasing, but the magnetism, it's stronger than before. It's almost like we're getting closer. Closer to what? Lena asked, the question hanging in the air like an unsaid challenge. Could they be nearing a discovery so monumental that it could rewrite everything they knew about Mars, and about humanity's place in the universe? Maria, standing nearby, joined the conversation, her voice calm but firm. Whatever it is, we're going in slowly. We have to make sure we don't trigger anything unexpected. The team fell into a hushed silence as the drill continued to move downward. Lena could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she watched the monitors, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. The anticipation was thick enough to cut through the air. Then, it happened. There was a sudden, sharp tremor. It was subtle at first, like a distant rumble beneath the surface. But the entire rover shuddered violently, and the monitors flickered as the drill hit something solid, something that wasn't rock. "Shut it down," Lena ordered. Her voice was urgent, but calm as she stepped forward, staring at the screen. Chris scrambled to engage the emergency stop, his hands working quickly to disengage the drill. But it was already too late. The damage had been done. The team held their breath as the drill's massive arm jerked once more, then froze. The readings were spiking wildly, the magnetic flux off the charts. And then, the screen went black. "Damn it," Chris muttered, slamming his fist against the console. "We've lost contact with the drill." Lena stood motionless for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. They had found something. But what? "Get the rover back to the site," Lena ordered. "We're going down to see what we've uncovered." Minutes later, Lena, Maria, and Chris stood on the surface of Mars, their helmets reflecting the red light of the dying sun. The rest of the crew was securing the rover, making sure all equipment was functioning. But the three of them were already making their way to the spot where the drill had been. The ground was cracked, an unnatural fissure had appeared, and in its depths, something metallic glinted in the dim light. It wasn't just rock, they had hit metal. And it wasn't just any metal. It had a strange, almost polished appearance, unlike anything they had ever seen on Mars. It looked, dare they say it, engineered. Lena knelt down beside the jagged edges of the fissure, her gloved hand brushing against the smooth surface of the object beneath the dust. This is a structure." The others gathered around her, their gazes fixed on the strange metallic object half buried beneath the Martian soil. It was shaped in an unfamiliar manner, curved, almost cylindrical. Some sections appeared to be shattered, as though something had caused it to break apart ages ago. But despite its age, the metal still shimmered in the fading sunlight. "We need to get the rest of the team down here," Maria said quietly. "This is beyond anything we expected." Lena nodded, her mind spinning. The implications were enormous. They had just uncovered the first tangible proof of something artificial on Mars. It wasn't just a structure, it was evidence of an intelligence, something that had been on Mars long before humanity set foot on its surface. The question was no longer if Mars had been home to life, it was who or what had built this. Back at the base, the full team gathered around the communication table. Everyone had seen the images of the metallic structure, and no one seemed to know quite what to say. The evidence was staring them in the face, but it was something they were all struggling to comprehend. This is beyond anything we thought possible," Maria said, her voice quieter than usual. "How did this get here? And how did we not know it was here?" Lena, still processing the enormity of the discovery, spoke up. "It's clear that this structure was deliberately constructed. The metal is too smooth, too advanced to be a natural formation. We're dealing with something alien." The word hung in the air like an electric charge, electrifying everyone in the room. Alien. For years, scientists had speculated about the possibility of extraterrestrial life, but now, with this structure, they were faced with undeniable proof. Mars had once hosted someone, capable of engineering a complex structure. "We need to learn everything we can," Lena said, her tone resolute. "This could change everything, our understanding of Mars, of life beyond Earth, of the history of this planet." "But how do we approach it?" Chris asked, looking at the rest of the team. "We don't know what we're dealing with here. What if it's dangerous? What if it's part of something far bigger?" "Whatever it is, we have to find out," Lena responded. "We've come too far to turn back now." The team agreed unanimously. They would begin excavation in the morning, cautiously removing the layers of Mars' surface to reveal the full extent of the structure. But for now, there was only one thing that mattered: the secret they had uncovered was just the beginning. Later that evening, Lena stood alone at the base's observation window, staring out into the endless expanse of Mars. It was hard to put into words what they had found. A part of her had always hoped for this moment, a discovery that would validate everything they had worked for. But another part of her was afraid. What if this is only the tip of the iceberg? Lena thought. What if Mars is hiding something far more dangerous than we realize? Her thoughts were interrupted when Chris walked in, his face grim. Lena, you should come see this. We've got something else. She followed him back to the command center, where the latest data had just come in. The metal structure they had uncovered wasn't the only anomaly on Mars. There were others, across the planet. Multiple readings, all pointing to something buried deep beneath the surface, scattered across Mars in locations that had once been considered barren. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Mars wasn't just hiding one secret. It was hiding many. Lena stood in the dimly lit command center, her eyes glued to the series of new readings on the monitor. The team had gathered around, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of the screens. What had initially seemed like a singular discovery, a lone alien structure buried beneath the Martian surface, was now something much larger. Scattered across Mars were anomalies, not just one, but several locations all pointing toward a hidden network. The implications were staggering. This changes everything, Maria muttered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the equipment. She stepped closer to the monitor, her fingers tapping lightly on the surface. These readings, they're coming from all over the planet. Lena nodded, trying to process what they were seeing. The data was unmistakable. The magnetic anomalies, the strange metal beneath the surface, it was as if the planet had been built with hidden pathways, a complex network of structures and signals buried deep within the crust. The map in front of them showed multiple sites, each with varying degrees of intensity, but all linked in some way. We were blind to it all, Lena said softly, her words almost to herself. For all these years, we thought Mars was just a barren wasteland. But it's been hiding something. Something we couldn't see. Chris leaned over the terminal, scrutinizing the data. Look at these coordinates. These structures, they're not random. They're aligned. There's a pattern here. They're part of something bigger. Lena stepped forward, her mind racing. She had always believed Mars held secrets, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. Was this a lost civilization? Or had someone, something, built these structures for a purpose? And if they were part of a network, what were they meant to do? Are these signals, Chris began, his voice trailing off, unsure of how to finish his thought. Are they still active? That's the question, Lena replied, trying to make sense of the data herself. The magnetic pulses had a distinct pattern to them, almost like a signal, a faint hum emanating from the depths of Mars. It was almost as if they were being called towards something, invited to discover the truth. Maria's voice broke the silence. We need to get a closer look. If these sites are connected, we have to understand what they're part of. Are they sending out a message? Or, are they part of something else? Something bigger? Lena's mind snapped back to their discovery at the drill site. The metal they had uncovered, it hadn't been just an isolated object. It was part of something much larger. A network. They had no choice now but to follow the trail. But the question lingered, what would they find? The next day, the team was ready to move out. The rover was packed, the equipment secured. This mission was now unlike any they had ever embarked upon. What had once been a simple excavation project was now a race to uncover something far greater than they could have ever expected. Lena's heart beat faster as she prepared for the journey to the next site. This time, they weren't just drilling blindly, they were going after a network of hidden structures. And each new discovery would bring them closer to the truth. As they drove across the Martian landscape, the gravity of their situation began to set in. The last few days had been a whirlwind of information, anomalies, magnetic pulses, hidden structures. Lena kept glancing at the map on the rover's screen. Each new coordinate took them deeper into Mars, closer to unlocking whatever was buried beneath the surface. They weren't just exploring for resources anymore. They were exploring a puzzle. And every piece they uncovered raised more questions. The air was thin, and the sky was a perpetual red. Outside, the vast emptiness of Mars stretched endlessly, as if mocking their small presence. And yet, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone on this planet. Not anymore. Hours later, they arrived at the second site, located near an ancient riverbed. The location was eerily quiet, devoid of any recognizable landmarks, yet the sensors on the rover told them they were in the right spot. "There's something here," Chris said, eyes scanning the horizon. "Right beneath us." Lena stepped out of the rover, the cold Martian wind stinging her face as she adjusted her helmet. The landscape stretched out, desolate and barren. But she could sense it, something was buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The magnetic fluctuations were more intense here, the ground hummed with an unseen energy. "Let's start the scan," Maria ordered, her voice calm but with an edge of anticipation. Lena nodded. The team had brought more advanced equipment this time, a deep penetration radar designed to look through the layers of soil and rock. They needed to find something solid, something unmistakable. The radar whirred to life, sending out pulses into the ground. It took several minutes before the first signal returned, something large. Something buried deep. "Got it," Chris said, his voice tight with excitement. "There's something down there. It's big." Lena felt a rush of adrenaline. "Let's go." The excavation process was slow. The team worked carefully, digging down into the Martian surface with precision, determined not to cause any damage to whatever lay beneath. As the layers of rock and soil were peeled away, they uncovered something incredible, what appeared to be another piece of the metallic structure. But this one was different. It was far larger, stretching across the ground in a curved, almost seamless formation. "It's like a bridge," Maria said, her voice filled with awe as she looked at the large object half buried in the sand. Lena crouched beside it, running her gloved hand along the smooth surface of the metal. It was colder than the surrounding rocks, and the texture was unlike anything they had seen before. Almost like glass. But no, it wasn't glass. It was something stronger, something that defied all their understanding of Martian geology. "This could be the core of the network," Lena said, her voice thick with wonder. "This is a communication node." "Or a power source," Chris added. "It could be anything. But we need to get more data. Fast." The team immediately began setting up their equipment, taking readings, scanning for any signs of activity. The magnetic pulses were growing stronger, and there was a faint vibration underfoot that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the structure. As Lena stood, watching the crew work, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something far greater than a simple discovery. They weren't just uncovering relics of an ancient civilization. They were uncovering a system, a web of connections that stretched across the planet. And whatever its purpose had been, it was clear that it was far from dormant. Something was awakening. Back at the base, Lena sat at the command center, poring over the new data. The scans had revealed more about the metallic structure, its composition, its size, its exact location relative to the other anomalies. But there was one thing that stood out above all else: the network was interconnected. Each of these sites, spread out across the planet, was part of a much larger, coordinated system. And now, it seemed, the system was active. "This network," Lena murmured, as her fingers hovered over the screen. "It's not just a relic. It's a signal. It's calling out." She sat back in her chair, eyes fixed on the screen. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Mars was hiding something far more complex than they could ever have imagined. And whatever that something was, they were only scratching the surface. The discovery of the hidden network beneath Mars had altered everything. It wasn't just a matter of scientific curiosity anymore, it was a race against time. As Lena sat alone in the command center, watching the data streams, her thoughts ran wild. They were no longer just explorers, they were the first to unlock an ancient, dormant intelligence buried deep within the Martian surface. And now, they were about to make their final push to understand what had been lost for eons. The rest of the team had gathered in the main lab, preparing for the final expedition. The map of anomalies across Mars had grown increasingly complex, but one thing was certain: they had identified a central hub, a location where all the signals converged. It was deeper than any site they had previously uncovered, and from the intensity of the magnetic readings, it was clear that this location was the heart of the network. They had to reach it, whatever it was, whatever it had been. Lena's hand hovered over the console. The mission they were about to undertake felt monumental. More than just uncovering history, they were on the verge of unraveling a mystery that could alter everything they knew about the universe. She could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down on her. "Lena," Maria's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're ready. It's time to go." Lena nodded and stood up, walking out to meet her team. They were fully suited up, their equipment secured. This was the moment they had been working toward. Everything they had done, everything they had discovered, had led to this singular point. The rover was prepped for the final trek across Mars' surface. The team was about to embark on the most critical journey of their lives. The journey across Mars felt like a dream. The landscape stretched out before them, an endless, barren sea of red dust and rock. The silence of the planet was deafening, and yet, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The strange magnetic pulses had become more frequent, almost as if the planet itself was aware of their presence. As they neared the site, the intensity of the pulses grew stronger, and Lena could feel the ground vibrating beneath her feet. This was it. The center of the network. The team disembarked and approached the location with caution, their eyes fixed on the ground where the signals seemed to converge. There was no doubt about it, the Martian surface here was different. The terrain was fractured, with large fissures crisscrossing the land, and the soil was darker, almost black in some areas. It wasn't natural. "Look at this," Chris said, pointing to a large, perfectly round crater in the distance. "This is no ordinary impact site." Lena followed his gaze. There, in the center of the crater, something gleamed faintly in the dim sunlight. It was metal, much like the previous structures they had uncovered, but this time it was far more intricate, almost crystalline in appearance. As they approached it, Lena's breath caught in her throat. The structure was enormous, much larger than anything they had encountered before. "This is it," Maria said quietly. "This is the heart of the network." Lena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They had found the source, the core of whatever had been buried on Mars all these years. It wasn't just a structure, it was a nexus of some kind, a place where all the hidden pieces of the Martian puzzle converged. They began to dig carefully around the site, their tools cutting through the Martian crust with precision. As the layers peeled away, the metal structure began to emerge in full. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, smooth, polished, with strange, geometric patterns etched into its surface. The surface of the structure shimmered as if it were alive, responding to their presence. "This is," Lena's voice faltered, awestruck. "This is a beacon." "A beacon?" Maria asked, clearly puzzled. Lena stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch the smooth surface. The moment her fingers made contact, a jolt of energy surged through her body. It was as if the structure had recognized them. A low hum filled the air, resonating deep within the bones of the team members. The signal was no longer just a pulse. It was a call. A response. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a sound that echoed through the Martian landscape, the structure activated. Bright, otherworldly light poured from the surface, illuminating the darkened crater like a miniature sun. The ground beneath them trembled as if the entire planet was awakening. Lena stepped back, wide-eyed. "It's a message," she whispered. "This is a message from the past." Suddenly, a holographic image flickered to life in the air above the structure. It was a map, an intricate network of lines and dots, stretching out across Mars. The lines pulsed with energy, and the dots blinked intermittently. It was as though the planet itself was alive with activity, its dormant systems reawakening after a long, quiet sleep. The map was something entirely foreign to them. It showed Mars not as they had known it, but as it had been in an ancient time, alive with activity, full of networks of communication and power that spanned the globe. They could see evidence of structures that had been buried, systems that had been dormant for eons. But what was most astonishing was the realization that this network was not just Martian in origin. "This is a universal network," Chris breathed, his voice trembling with disbelief. "It's a system that spans beyond Mars. Beyond Earth." Lena turned to him, her mind racing. "What do you mean? Are you saying this network isn't just from Mars? It's from somewhere else?" Chris nodded. "Yes. Look at the map, it's too advanced. It's not from any civilization we know. This was part of a larger network that spanned multiple planets. Mars was just one node in a much greater system." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The realization was overwhelming. Mars had once been a hub for something far greater than any of them could have imagined. And now, that network had been reawakened. The team stood in silence as the hologram continued to flicker and pulse, the map shifting and changing before their eyes. It was as if the planet itself was sharing its history with them, offering them a glimpse into the ancient past of Mars and its connections to distant worlds. But Lena knew they had only begun to scratch the surface. This was just the beginning. As the team worked to gather the data, Lena stood apart from them, her thoughts racing. The implications of their discovery were staggering. Mars wasn't just a dead world, it had once been a thriving hub of interplanetary communication. And somehow, the knowledge of this network had been buried, lost to time. But now, it was waking up. And the question was no longer just about Mars. It was about the universe. The beacon had awakened, and the message it carried was clear: Mars was not the end of the story. It was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And they were the ones who had uncovered it. The team was silent, each member lost in their own thoughts. They had made history. But the true extent of their discovery was still unknown. What had once been hidden beneath Mars' surface was now exposed, waiting for them to unlock its secrets. The network had been reawakened, and whatever came next would change everything. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?